Good morning and welcome to the 11th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2026. Our first item of business is a decision on taking item 8 in private. Item 8 is consideration of the evidence we've heard from the Climate Change Committee. Are we agreed to take this item in private? We are agreed. The second item is the consideration of a draft statutory instrument, the Public Services Reform Scottish Water Order 2026. The purpose of the order is to amend the Water Industry Scotland Act 2002, which sets out the statutory requirements for the composition of the Board of Scottish Water. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee have made no comment on the instrument, and I'd like to welcome to the meeting Gillian Martin, the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action and Energy, and her supporting officials. I've got James Simpson, who is the Unit Head for the Water Industry Division, and Lucy Drummy, who is a lawyer for the Scottish Government. The instrument is laid under an affirmative procedure, which means it cannot come into force unless the Parliament approves it. Following the evidence session, the committee will be invited to consider a motion recommending the instrument be approved. I remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate as follows. And now invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I'll take committee through the instrument under the Water Industry Scotland Act 2002. Scottish Water must have a minimum of 3 executive members on its board. So this statutory requirement is currently filled by the appointments of the Chief Executive Officer, Chief Financial Officer and Chief Operating Officer as executive members. And the simple purpose of this legislation is to reduce that minimum to 2 executive members. This amendment will support the governance arrangements regarding executive representation that Scottish Water intends to implement on retirement later this year of the Chief Operating Officer, whose role is not being backfilled. The CEO and the CFO will remain executive members. So this proposal will therefore help ensure the effective administration and governance of the Scottish Water Board and reflect changes to the senior management structure. In line with the Public Services Reform Scotland Act 2010, I consider that this order will improve the exercise of the public functions of Scottish Water, particularly in regard to its economy, efficiency and effectiveness. This amendment will avoid a scenario where Scottish Water is required to designate a new executive member with the associated remuneration, even though the board does not believe that that is the best course of action. Effective oversight of Scottish Water's executive will continue through the non-executive directors, whose composition and responsibilities remain unchanged. The Scottish Government consulted key stakeholders on the proposal, none of whom raised any substantive concerns, and I'm happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Just looking at the regulation regarding to this, it seems that if the Executive Board is being reduced from 3 to 2, and I think the requirement in the legislation is the non-executives outnumber the Executive Board members by 2. Is your proposal in due course then to reduce the numbers of non-exec directors in Scottish Water?
No, the non-executive directors will remain at the same level as they are now.
I know they will under this order. My question is, in the future, having reduced the Executive Board by 1, would it be your vision that the number of non-executive directors could be reduced as well?
There's no plans to do so.
No plans to do so. Okay. Sarah, I think you've got some questions you'd like to ask.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, it was good to get that clarification that there's not going to be a reduction in the other board members. But in the evidence we've had, trade unions have got in touch to say this is a actually really good opportunity to have trade union representatives on the board of Scottish Water, and I was wondering if that's part of your consideration at the moment. Obviously 3 trade unions in Scottish Water, and like many others, they have shared concerns, but they think that in line with the Scottish Government's Fair Work and Fair Work First principles, having a worker's voice involved in the forum that has the oversight of Scottish Water would be a big step forward. And they give the example of the recent industrial disputes, which seem to have gone on forever without resolution, that actually having people at the board would actually lead to a more constructive, more accountable framework. And I think just in recent days, they've expressed concerns about Scottish Water being privatised by stealth, and the fact it's now almost indistinguishable from the private sector companies down south. So I think there's quite a concern that this is, if we put this through today, it's a real opportunity. Unite the Union, Unison Scotland and GMB could potentially get properly involved in the oversight, and that would bring many benefits. So I was wondering what the Cabinet Secretary is thinking about that. They would be looking for 3, another option, but at least have trade union rep on the board and deliver more accountability and constructive working relationships. Thank you, Convener.
So I'm aware of the calls of the unions for this. There are no plans to do so. During in 2002, when the water industry bill was considered, they considered how best to represent staff interests at board level. And at that point, when the bill was going through the Parliament, there was a rejection of the ability to have union representation on the board. And indeed, there's no other worker representation on the board of any public body. So actually what they've done in Scottish Water, as per the bill, is that they have a current non-executive member was appointed as having specialist knowledge of employee interests. That person was reappointed in May 2025. And following that period that you mentioned of industrial action and strained industrial relations, we have sought greater clarity from Scottish Water's Director of People and Director of Governance to ensure that they're clear on their responsibilities and manage any potential conflicts. If I can come to the other point that is made in some of the report that's out there, I do reject that Scottish Water has been privatised by stealth. I think that is the phrase. Scottish Water, I'm very proud to say, and I think we should all be proud that it is a publicly owned resource. We just have to look at the situation in other parts of the UK where water is privatised. Indeed, even last week there were documentaries on television showing the really disgraceful situation there are with some of the actions of private water companies. So Scottish Water, every penny of profit is put back into improving the operations of water in Scotland. We remain committed to a publicly owned Scottish Water where all profits go back to improving the service. Scottish Water is performing well as a publicly owned corporation, and indeed if they contract other private companies, it is largely to do with any kind of capital expenditure programmes in terms of improving the infrastructure and they have a large programme of work in which they are improving the infrastructure for Scottish Water throughout the country. So I do reject that characterisation of it being privatised. It is not privatised, it is in public hands, and not a penny of profit goes to shareholders, which could not be said for other water companies in the UK.
Just before we leave this subject, I read the union's letter. It seemed they were each union asking to have a representative. So that's 3 on a board of between 5 and 8 non-execs, which would be quite heavy in my mind. Could you just remind me, Cabinet Secretary, who is the person that's on the board with the specialist knowledge of employment? Just so if we're asked, we know.
Want their name?
Yeah.
It's Steve Dixon.
And what's his experience?
My officials may have his title to hand. We can.
So the 2002 Act requires the appointment of a non-executive member with employee interests, and Steve Dixon, perhaps policy officials will be able to chip in, but he is considered to have the relevant experience for that role. Okay,
just remind me what that is, if you wouldn't mind.
I'll jump in if you want here. I don't have Mr Dixon's CV to hand, but we can certainly provide the committee with that information.
It would be useful to know that that's been fully considered by the committee. Did you want to come back in, sir?
Oops, yes, thanks. It was just reflecting on previous evidence we've heard that it's not just a new capital investment, but there's concerns amongst workers in Scottish Water that there are actually less workers because there are contracts that are being outsourced, and it's to what extent could you take a longer term approach because we are Cabinet Secretary is absolutely right. We are going to see a lot more investment in our water infrastructure to make it resilient, to make it modern and up to date. Wouldn't that be an opportunity to actually expand the staff so that they get decent terms and conditions and you're not outsourcing all to private companies?
Secretary, I'll let you answer some of that, but just bear in mind, Sarah, it was a nice push, but we are considering a specific statutory instrument. So if you want to answer that briefly, Cabinet Secretary, you may.
I mean, that's an operational matter for Scottish Water, who they employ. They currently employ nearly 5,000 staff. If they expand their operations, then that's up to them if they want to expand the employees. And I would say that 5,000 staff, all of who continue to benefit from being part of the public sector pay policy, it is not right to say that there is not fair work and pay and conditions.
Okay, I think that took us a bit far away from the statutory instrument, but Mark, I think you've got a question you'd like to ask.
Yeah, I mean, it's disappointing if there isn't that automatic seat for worker representation on the board. And I note that with ScotRail, I think there's a representative on the board who's come from an STUC senior position. So I think that's the kind of representation that we would be looking for with a public utility. If I just come back to the balance then of non-executive and executive members, you're saying Steve Dixon is there to kind of represent interests around employment, employee rights. There's a background there. Not sure what it is. We'll get the CV through. Maybe we can Google it. But also note that the reduction in executive board directors includes the reduction of the chief operating officer, who would normally be responsible for all elements in relation to staffing, recruitment, terms and conditions. So I'm a bit concerned. I think the Wicks has also raised this concern that with the CEO no longer in existence and part of the board, there's a danger that some of the issues around staffing, which have been, in the public eye with the concerns of unions, could somehow slip off the agenda a little bit more. So who will be primarily responsible from the executive board member team now for those issues which are of concern and importance?
The CEO will be responsible for those issues. I'm a little bit confused that I didn't have any concerns raised to me by Wicks about this decision at all. In fact, actually, looking at most of the executive roles in other public bodies, it's actually quite unusual for them there to be 3 separate roles. So actually this is bringing them more in line with other public bodies. And I also want to reflect about the specific employee interest member. That member was, the STUC was directly consulted on the appointment of this person and commented on the scope of the role in 2020 before it was last advertised, and then the member was subsequently reappointed in 2025. So I think members obviously want to know more about the credentials of this member, and I'm happy to liaise with Scottish Water and get them to give the committee that information, because I think that that seems to be the substantive ask of members of the committee, that the employee interest member, that you know a little bit more about their credentials.
Okay, but your expectation then is the CEO will take over the role of the COO on the board in relation to staffing, because the evidence that we have had, and we can forward it to your team, Cabinet Secretary, is that the Wicks believe that there's a real need for oversight at board level when it comes to those previous COO responsibilities, particularly in relation to staffing. So that's why I'm asking the question, because I've had the evidence
Wicks have
from
not
Wicks,
raised anything,
and I'm coming today asking the question that we've had in evidence as a committee. So I'm relaying it.
Bring in James.
Sure. So the CEO's responsibilities in the round will be split across the senior management team, and that's a decision for the CEO as accountable officer. But in terms of staffing responsibilities and oversight, there's a director of people within the senior management team, and that role will remain. Any matters, whether it's people matters, health, safety and wellbeing, they will be brought by the appropriate person to the board, as is already the case. But in terms of that regularity of the board receiving this information, the CEO report already covers this, and he already holds that accountability.
Okay.
Just to help you, Cabinet Secretary, the Wicks responded to the committee on the 27th of November 2025, and a copy of that letter was sent to you where they expressed their concerns and also asked questions to you about how the cost savings would be implemented and shown. So I'm sure you've looked at that letter and you'll be responding to them to let them know if the answers. Okay. If there's no further questions on this, we can move on to the next item, which is a debate on motion S6M20592, calling for the committee to recommend that the Public Services Reform Scottish Water Order 2026 be approved. Cabinet Secretary, I can ask you to speak to and move the motion, or just move the motion, whichever you see as fit.
I'll move the motion.
Thank you. Are there any contributions from members? No? Cabinet Secretary, you do get the chance to sum up, but as no one said anything, I'm not sure you'll want to sum up. Do you want to sum up?
Thank you.
Thank you. So the question is that motion S6M20592 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. And therefore, I'm just going to ask the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. Are you all happy, committee, for me to do that? As nods of head. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you to your officials. I'll now briefly suspend to allow a change of witnesses, and we'll start again at 9 o'clock. Welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. Item 4 is consideration of a further draft statutory instrument, the Renewable Obligation Scotland Amendment Order 2026. This order would change the index used to make inflationary adjustments to the renewable obligations buyout price from the retail prices index to the consumer price index from the 1st of April 2026. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has made no comment on the instrument. I welcome back to the meeting Gillian Martin, the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action and Energy, and also welcome her supporting officials. There's Madeleine Platter, the Unit Head for Energy Market and Strategy, and Matthew Lowry, the Policy Manager for Energy Market Strategy from the Scottish Government. The instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means it cannot come into force unless the Parliament approves it. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited to consider a motion recommending the instrument be approved. I'm sure I don't need to remind everyone that Scottish Government officials can speak in this item, but not in the debate that follows, should there be one. I'd like to now invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener, and I'll just take again the committee through the amendment order. It makes one technical but important change to the Renewables Obligation Scotland scheme. Currently, certain elements of the scheme, known as the buyout price and the mutualisation cap, rise each year in line with the retail price index, and from April this year, subject to parliamentary approval, these values will be updated using the consumer price index, leading to savings in the energy system. The Renewables Obligation Scotland has supported renewable electricity generation in Scotland since 2002 by issuing certificates to generators which can then be sold to suppliers. And these electricity suppliers can use these certificates to meet their obligations under the scheme, or they can make a payment known as the buyout price. The amendment order ensures consistency across the UK, which is essential for market stability, ensures a level playing field for suppliers and generators operating across borders. The Consumer Price Index is recognised as a more accurate and reliable measure of inflation, whereas the Retail Price Index tends to produce higher inflation figures, which could lead to the buyout price rising faster than is justified. This adds unnecessary and avoidable costs on electricity suppliers, which are ultimately passed on to households and businesses. So switching to the Consumer Price Index will ensure fairness for consumers, whilst maintaining strong investor confidence in our renewable sector. The change does not alter how the overall scheme works. It's a simple technical change to the annex, the annual indexation mechanism only. And we jointly consulted with the UK Government and Northern Ireland Assembly to seek views on two options, which was an immediate switch to the Consumer Price Index or gradual realignment. And following careful consideration of the responses, all three governments agreed to proceed with an immediate switch to the Consumer Price Index. And we recognise many industry stakeholders were initially concerned about the potential for change to undermine investor confidence and increase the cost of capital, but we consider this approach strikes the appropriate balance between reducing costs for consumers and supporting continued investment in the renewables industry. The change has no expected financial impact on the Scottish Government. We'll continue to engage with industry stakeholders and monitor the operation of the scheme. It's a necessary and proportionate amendment to keep the scheme fair, efficient and aligned across the UK. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And the renewable obligations. Just tell me, could you, if you wouldn't mind, Cabinet Secretary, where the UK Government is and the Northern Ireland Executive is in regards to their legislation in relation to this?
So,
has Northern Ireland passed, have they agreed it, the Northern Irish Executive, and has the UK Government put it through?
Well, I'll go to my officials for that.
So, Madeleine.
This is the first one in terms of looking at the legislation. So all three schemes are looking at amending their own respective legislation. So the renewables obligation in Northern Ireland and in England and Wales. But this is the first committee hearing, so we're the first one to consider it.
When are the others going through?
I haven't got the dates in front of me, but it'll be in the next few weeks because the aim.
April.
Yes, exactly.
Which is why I was trying to find out where we were,
and it needs
whether
to come in force before the 1st of April, so that all the arrangements can be made in terms of the operation of the scheme.
Okay. And just if the Northern Ireland Executive doesn't agree, where does that leave this position? You think they will?
I think they will, because that's the recommendation that's been made by the government, and there's been no substantive concerns raised in the consultation.
Sometimes the government doesn't always get its way. I'm sure you'd agree, Cabinet Secretary. Are there any other questions, though, on this? Yes, Douglas.
Ask briefly, Cabinet Secretary. So you mentioned that this won't affect people's bills at all. Is that correct?
There'll be cost savings across the energy system, but DESNES and the Treasury will be looking at how this is actually, what impact this would have on energy bills. For them, there will be cost savings across the system, and of course, if there's cost savings for the generators, then I would expect them to be passed on to bill payers. But that's not for the Scottish Government to decide. That's for the UK Government.
Of course. And is this the obligations that's actually been removed from people's bills and moved into general taxation? Am I right in thinking that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? No. Okay, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is a debate on motion S6M 20600, calling for the committee to recommend that the Renewable Obligations Scotland Amendment Order 2006 draft be approved. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to it and move the motion. You can just move it, Cabinet
I'll move
Secretary.
the motion.
Thank you. Are there any members that want to make a contribution? At this stage, there aren't. Cabinet Secretary, I assume you will not want to sum up. But you can do if you want to.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you. The question is that motion S6M 20600 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve the draft of the report for publication. Is everyone happy with that? We are. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you to your officials. I shall suspend the meeting briefly to allow a changeover of witnesses, and we'll start again at 12 minutes past 9. Thank you. Welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. This is an evidence session with the Climate Change Committee on the Scottish Government's draft climate change plan. The purpose of today's evidence session is to enable the committee to hear directly from the Climate Change Committee on its progress in reducing emissions in Scotland, 2025 report published on the 25th of February, and to explore how the Climate Change Committee's findings and recommendations relate to the draft climate change plan, which the committee reported on last week. As the Climate Change Committee report was published shortly before the committee agreed its own report on the draft plan, the session provides an opportunity to consider areas of alignment and divergence between the two reports and to inform the forthcoming chamber debate, which is on the 5th of March, Thursday. I'm going to welcome to the committee Dr. Emily Nurse, the head of Net Zero, and Emma Pinchback, the Chief Executive for Climate Change Committee. Thank you for attending this morning, albeit remotely, and I invite Emma to give a brief opening statement.
Thank you. So to start with the good news, we find that Scotland's emissions are down over 2.6% between 2021 and 2023, and overall emissions are now over half from 1990 base levels. It's important to say that those historic emissions reductions have been delivered largely from decarbonising the power sector, and a key message for us this year is that we need a significantly more focus on areas where there are devolved powers to Scotland. We find about 58% of the emissions reductions in the CCP are from sectors with devolved powers. Since our last progress report, Scotland has obviously accepted the advice on the carbon budgets, legislated these targets and produced the CCP. And we find that Scotland's first carbon budget, which is the one 2026 to 2030, is achievable, with around 91% of the emissions for this period covered by credible plans in the CCP. However, we are concerned about planning for the carbon budgets beyond 2030. So we say net zero by 2045 is achievable, but it will need much clearer plans for delivery. And to draw attention to two particular areas, on heat, we are concerned that there's not much detail or planning for the next 10 years in buildings, and an assumption of decarbonisation in the last years of the 2030s, a delay and catch-up approach that we can't see evidence will work. And similarly, another area, Scotland leads the UK on tree planting. It's important both for Scotland and for UK emissions as a whole that Scotland continues to plant trees at a sufficient rate. But since cuts to the forestry grant scheme, we've seen those rates plummeting, having been at record levels. In the opening, I also want to draw attention to some specific and technical issues with the climate change plan, which are: there's an intent in the CCP to track emissions progress at subsector level and to develop early warning indicators. This is very welcome, but there are some missing indicators or ones that we think are insufficient. In particular, for example, there's no indicator for the deployment of low carbon heating, livestock numbers, recycling rates, and so on. There are three significant areas of the methodology to highlight as well. One, we are worried that the Scottish Government has accounted for emissions reductions from peatland based on new evidence, which is welcome that they're doing that research on peatland emissions, but the way they've integrated it into their assumptions for emissions reduction and their baseline, we think might lead to a possible overestimate of the benefits of that research in their accounting. Secondly, we think that it's possible that the emissions reductions from buildings, which have been significant, are because of record high energy prices, so people responding to those, and warmer winters. These aren't structural and permanent emissions reduction changes, and in the case of people turning down their heating, are not something we want to see maintained, but we think that they've been baked into the assumptions the government is making. So we would like to see that looked at. And lastly, we haven't got contingencies given for areas of high risk, including the dependency on negative emissions technologies. And finally, briefly, just to flag that this spring we'll be publishing our advice to the UK as a whole on climate risk and resilience. And it is obvious that Scotland is already being affected by the impacts of climate change to key areas of the economy and to the prosperity and well-being of Scottish people. A central recommendation of the committee in the progress report and in our advice to the Scottish Government and in our advice to the UK Government as a whole is for more focus on communicating with the public the risks of climate change, but also what Scotland is trying to achieve with the carbon budgets and what actions will need to be taken by the government, by business and by individuals going forward. And I noticed that in your own report on the CCP, that was something that was pulled out too by others giving evidence. So I wanted to flag it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're going to go into questions now. And just at the start of this, because I fear, well, some part of the questioning will definitely revolve around agriculture. So I want to remind members of my register of interest that I have an interest in an arable farm and livestock farm in Murray, producing beef, beef production and herd replacement. So, Emma, I want to start off with just voicing some concerns and see whether you share my concerns. We are in the dying days of this Parliament. I think we have 3 more committee meetings and 3 more sitting weeks, 3.5 maybe. And we are just at the stage where we've considered the climate change plan in draft. So the government has undertaken to lay the plan before the end of the Parliament. Doesn't give them much time to reflect on what you've said or what we've said. Do you think it's a happy place to be with so little time to consider what is, I think in your own words, a critical stage of Scotland's move to net zero? Emma, that's you.
Thank you.
They should. It should be. You should. Your mic should come on.
It's on now. Look, I think in producing our own response to the CCP and weaving it into our progress report, you will know that we were delayed in being able to do that analysis because of delays to the CCP, and there were conversations with officials about trying to bring forward the government's work on the CCP to enable us to produce our analysis and so on. And I recognise that delay has been challenging, and it has been challenging for us to do our analysis in a timely way too. I think in terms of process and what it means for Parliament scrutiny, I think those are basically political and parliamentary processes that as a statutory body we shouldn't comment on. We will do updated advice on the final CCP when we do the progress report next time around, which is also what we do for the UK government, for example. So we would respond to the CCP or any draft plan from government, usually when we're doing our statutory progress reporting. So that will be the next time that we comment on the final plan.
Okay, I mean, my concern is that we are literally shortly going into recess, and the climate change plan will be laid, and unless I've got this entirely wrong, the whole process will be repeated in the same way in 5 years' time, which can't be a comfortable place to be. Surely, to allow you to fully consider it, although you'll be doing your annual reports, it would be better to do it before to consider the climate change plan, because I find it, if I'm honest, Emma, I found it really difficult to try and guide the committee through producing our report without having seen your report. It would have been far better for us to be able to see your report before we published ours. Can you not see the difficulties there?
No, I think for Parliament, certainly understand that it would be useful for you to have our reports when you're doing your scrutiny. I mean, you will know this, but to put on the record, it is a difference between Scotland and the UK that we report to government for both our progress reporting, and so how's it going, and also for the formal advice, whereas in the UK, our progress reporting is for Parliament and designed to do that, so it sits slightly outside government processes. Naturally, we will respond to both what's in the Act, but also any instructions from the Scottish Government, who are our statutory audience for this, but also any conversations or discussions or changes in process that Parliament and Scottish Government agree together. Like we would happily adjust our timelines if there is a change in the Act or an agreement about doing something different next time around. Just in terms of timeliness, it would obviously be good to have the next plan as soon as possible in the cycle, so we can get our analysis of any plan done when we're doing our formal progress reporting. We will usually do any analysis of a formal climate change plan or any other relevant strategy and policy from the government in the statutory progress reporting. That's also what we do UK-wide and for other devolved governments. So it would still be the case that we would look to produce our response to any CCP in our statutory progress reporting. But of course, the earlier we have a government's draft plan, the more we can do of that earlier and get it into a publication. And yes, of course, although we serve the Scottish Government, we're always happy to try and do things that help Parliament and good scrutiny.
Okay, well, just I think 3 weeks from the time the draft plan was laid, the consultations were summarised. Our report's been considered and will be considered in debate on Thursday. For the changes to be made and the due plan to be laid before the end of the Parliament, to me, seems an impossibly tight situation, and it will just be laid, and that'll be it, and there'll be no debate on it. And I find that all unhelpful, I would say, as a parliamentarian. I want to go back to a comment you made earlier, Emma, because I met with the Cabinet Secretary on behalf of the committee to ask for the Climate Change Committee to be in a position to give us evidence before the end of our evidence session. And Gillian Martin, the Cabinet Secretary, said that she would impress upon you the need for that, but you were only in a position to offer us a private meeting. Did you not think an open meeting would have been better? And did the government not give you the leeway to do that, which she indicated to me that she had done?
We will never do a public hearing if we haven't finished our analysis. And that is a precedent that is long established for the work of the CCC, because as a statutory body, we can't put information out on the public record which hasn't been fully QA'd or quality assured or finalised. And in this case, we hadn't finished our analysis on the CCP. That said, what we have done and did through this process is where we can share information or evidence that we are sure of. Earlier in the cycle, we will talk to officials at working level or indeed parliamentarians to try to give you a sense of the direction we're going in. That's why we offered a private briefing, but we did do that in consultation with the Scottish Government. So they are our statutory audience. We spoke to them about what we could do for you, determined it was private briefings, and that offer, as you know, was made to come up before publication, but also an offer was made to come up on the day of publication to try and do something publicly for you. I appreciate the difficulty of that, but it is exactly the same as we have done for example, the UK government, where similarly there was an ask to bring forward publication. Just lastly on this, the other thing to factor in is the counterfactual is, well, can you bring publication forward? Can you complete your analysis faster? And the reality is that we are very constrained on resources for doing our devolved work, and it would have been nigh on impossible to complete the analysis any quicker or to allocate resources to it without taking resources of other statutory outputs. And I think we've talked about this in previous evidence sessions, but I would welcome a conversation about the resources we have to do work for Scotland, because that will also enable us to be more flexible going forward, or could do. So it could bring that alternative possibility of trying to finish things faster forward.
Okay, just before we leave this, Emma, just clarify to me, just so I understand it, if you wouldn't mind. Did the Scottish Government, as your client, tell you could only give us a private briefing, or did they encourage you to give us a public briefing?
We didn't get an explicit instruction to come and speak to you publicly, and there was discussion with officials about what we could do on both sides, and it was determined that a private briefing would be the appropriate thing.
So the Scottish Government officials said a private briefing was the appropriate way to do it. I'm sorry, I'm pushing you on this because that doesn't quite tally with my remembrance of the conversations and the correspondence with the Scottish Government.
So in terms of, as Chief Exec of the CCC, we, in conversation with the Scottish Government, determined that a private briefing would be the appropriate thing. That's based on, firstly, what's in the Act. Secondly, the fact that we do not think it's appropriate to share incompleted analysis in public, and lastly, the resource element of not then being able to complete the analysis any faster or change our timelines in order to mitigate either of those first two things. So in my understanding, we agreed that it was a private briefing, and that's what we communicated back to you.
Thank you. That's helpful. Bob, you want to come in?
I suppose just for clarity around this, I really hope we can move on quickly from this and get into more substantive issues. But it's my understanding, I want to check if I'm accurate in relation to this, it would not be appropriate for the Scottish Government to instruct the Climate Change Committee to give a briefing to a committee of this Parliament, given the independent nature of the Climate Change Committee. If I've got that wrong, please do correct me, but I understand that to be the situation.
It's also, I mean, independence is one of the things, is a kind of significant factor in evaluating choices like this one about the appropriateness of not giving a public evidence session on incomplete analysis or being directed by the Scottish Government and so on. My understanding on the Act is that because we report to government for both the advice and the progress reporting, we are in effect giving independent advice to the government. They could then ask us to share that advice with you, I think, but we would then likely run up against the issues of the advice being incomplete and not being quality assured, and then being uncomfortable with sharing the committee's evidence before it was finalised. And that speaks to the fact that we, as the accounting officer of the organisation and as the chief executive, I also have to be responsible for the fact that we are there to provide you with really good, high integrity evidence that you can trust. If we start giving out information where we are still finalising it, then I think there would be a risk to the purpose of us as an independent body, but also the sense that our independent analysis is high quality. So it's a nuanced response based on what is in the Act, I think it's fair to say. But yes, independence is one of the things we consider.
That's helpful, thank you.
Just to finish that, and we'll move on to the next question, is the government made it clear that they are your client, and therefore they controlled that information. Mark, over to you with your next question.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I mean, turning to the climate change plan itself, I mean, you probably have had an opportunity to glance at our report from last week, and, you know, we do highlight a number of areas, a number of concerns around specific delivery plans and whether there's enough detail within the CCP to, you know, map out the policies, timelines, responsibilities that can offer that certainty that there are delivery plans, particularly within that first carbon budget. I think you've made some similar points. I want to give you the opportunity just to expand on what you think, you know, should be described in terms of delivery plan right now in order to build that certainty and to show that leadership towards meeting objectives. And if there are particular sectors you want to highlight.
Thank you. I mean, I'll give a high-level answer, but I might bring in Dr. Emily Nurse, who I think would like to talk to you about indicators. So in general, we think that there are good plans and policies in place, as I said, for the first carbon budget period. So that's the from now until around 2030. There are then less good policies and plans beyond that, and in particular we're concerned about plans and policies for heat decarbonisation, because it looks to us like in the draft CCP there isn't very much or any action or policies and plans covering around a decade of delivery, and then an assumption that there'll be a rapid rollout. Heat is a significant portion of Scotland's emissions, so that is an area of real concern. We're also concerned about agriculture separately for similar reasons. And as you might know, compared to the advice that we gave the Scottish Government, ScotGov has decided to do less on agriculture and livestock emissions and make that up with, in the CCP, negative emissions technology deployment going faster than the advice that we offered. Now, that is entirely in ScotGov's gift and something that we said is fine, the difference, but we would need to see evidence of how that's going to be delivered. And I think there are critical risks around negative emissions technologies, so clear delivery plans there, and understanding what the plans are for agriculture in more detail in the absence of thinking about livestock. And then I think we're also concerned and flagging in this progress report that there's been a real change in tree planting rates because of changes to forestry grant schemes, and having gone from record levels of tree planting, we're now it's really fallen off a cliff, and we will need to really pick up the rates of tree planting in order to deliver both the UK-wide carbon budgets, where Scotland has a big proportion of tree planting, but also for Scotland itself. So those are some areas I think of concern. In terms of technically, what would we like to see in the CCP to be sure about delivery and be able to offer you best evidence? I'd just like to bring in Dr. Emily Nurse to talk to you a bit about indicators and some of the methods in the CCP.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Emma, and thanks very much for having me here today. Yeah, there's a few things, I guess a few things to say at the higher level here. So one is, I'd say it's more of an overarching plan, but within that, plans are needed. So without the sort of upcoming plans that we're expecting, then we don't have the detail that we need to understand. And Emma's particularly pointed out heat and buildings. So really, we need to see the heat and building strategy and delivery plan that we're expecting this year, and we need that as soon as possible. Fourth, land use strategy, the industrial decarbonisation programme, and this route map that's alluded to for the negative emissions technologies. So it's kind of an overarching plan. For the first time, it gives quantified emissions reductions by policy and proposal. This is a significant step forwards, but the detail on what this really means, what the policies are going to be, what the delivery is in certain areas is really missing, and buildings is something that we've really highlighted. Emma's talked about the shape of this buildings pathway, where really very little happens over the next 10 years, and then it's supposed to accelerate extremely rapidly over the third carbon budget period. We would expect a sort of less risky approach to build on actually some positive progress we've seen so far in heat pump rollout, build up those supply chains rather than delay and then catch up at the last minute, because there's this 2045 target for buildings and for net zero overall. And then the other thing I want to talk about, and I don't know if we'll get into this in more detail, but is this monitoring and evaluation framework, which we think is really welcome. It's really welcome to look at emissions at a subsector level and at the sector level, and to look at a deployment of low carbon tech and other indicators of progress. But what is missing in the plan is what we expect to see in all these areas. And so how do you then judge whether you're on track and whether action is needed? So what we really would want to see in the final climate change plan is laying out clearly what is expected in order for this plan to be credible, and what's underlying the modelling, so that can then be monitored. So as an example, we don't have sectoral emissions pathways that are annual, so they're given as carbon budget averages. We know there's an 18-month lag in emissions reporting. So take an example, if we're taking carbon budget averages, they're similar to the midpoint of a carbon budget, not exactly the same. So the midpoint of carbon budget 1 is 2028. We then won't get emissions data for that until mid-2020, until very close, basically, to the end of the carbon budget, which ends in 2030. So this is too late for any action to happen, right? So we need more data that's annual on emissions so that we can track it. It's not targets, but it's indicative so that we can track it. And we really need these indicators that Emma mentioned. There are some in there. So we sort of managed to cobble together some in our progress report, chapter 4 of our progress report. We've looked at indicators, but we're missing some really key ones, and we don't have them annually for really a lot of them. And they're not sort of all summarised somewhere that's convenient. So there's none for low carbon heat. There's none for heat pumps. And we've already talked about this being a significant risk. We need to know what's needed in terms of rolling out low carbon heat. So this is something that we've really called for, and we think that we should see in the final plan, so we can properly evaluate, properly monitor, and if anything's going off track, have time to implement contingency and backup plans.
Yeah, thanks. There's certainly a lot of hockey sticks in this plan, a lot of kind of slow growth and then suddenly, a shoot up in future carbon budgets. I suppose I'm what I'm interested in then is how you really tailor your advice and how the work of this committee and successor committee can really engage with the plan, particularly in the next carbon budget going forward, so that if there is a point where we're not getting certainty about how delivery rates will suddenly shoot up in future carbon budgets, what's that kind of early warning sign look like? I mean, if there are still contingencies, dependencies that to be worked out, if programmes have to change and evolve over time, that can't really be done at the end of the next parliamentary session where we all look at a climate change plan again and go, oh, we're not sure how we're going to deliver this. I mean, there needs to be a process of evolving some of the delivery plans over time. So what kind of advice would you be hoping to kind of give us at what point within the next carbon budget which will enable plans and delivery plans to be revisited if we're not getting certainty about what the trajectory looks like for the next 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, so I can quickly say something on that, and I think Emma wants to come in. So in our progress report every year, we look at this as best we possibly can. So we look at these indicators of delivery. We look at emissions. Of course, there's this lag in emissions reporting. And what we've done this time is we have tracked where we think things need to be wherever we can against the climate change plan. So we do have a trajectory for electric vehicles because we know that they are the same rollout as our advice that we gave last year. There are some things like electric charge points where there's the target in 2026, which actually was met 2 years earlier, and then again in 2030. So there's a sort of linear interpolation between those. We also have our modelling. So we have our modelling and we do have that annual for many of these things. So if there's an absence of a clear trajectory from the climate change plan, we look at what we think should be happening, and then we can judge against that. Of course, this gets difficult when the plan, as Emma said quite rightly, is different in terms of the detail of how to meet the carbon budgets than ours. That's well within the government's gift. But that then becomes difficult. So if we say there should be, a certain trajectory for livestock numbers, we don't know what the trajectory is in the plan, so we can't track against that. We can only track against ours, which makes this more tricky. But we do our best in the annual progress reports to really look at these indicators. It's a really big part of our progress monitoring, actually, and it really informs whether we think we're on track. Emma, I think you want to come in as well.
Thank you. I've read your committee's report on the CCP, and I noted that something that was suggested by other witnesses and was being thought about was a sort of dashboard for indicators. And just to be clear, that is what we produce in the progress reports, and this is a new system for Scotland, but we will do a progress report as a statutory output every year now, which, as Emily says, will look at a range of indicators. If we have indicators in the final CCP, we can then track against them. That's why it's so important for us, as well as the indicators that we have ourselves about Scotland's emissions. And we will give that to the Scottish Government. But just to build on earlier answers, that output is for the Scottish Government under the Act, but we design it as a public document to be used by parliamentarians and policymakers, and indeed other delivery and public bodies. So that is the main instrument that we have as a contribution, and I would suggest that's quite a good place to start thinking about what you need and what you think would be useful in those progress reports. And I know our new chair is very interested to hear from parliamentarians about how to make those progress reports useful. Aside from that, we are also able to offer ad hoc advice, come up and give evidence sessions and so on things that are of concern to parliamentarians with the best evidence that we have. But that would be our main recommendation to use those progress reports to do this. That is what they're for.
Okay, and do you have the resources to do that? So if we were to see a stronger engagement from the Climate Change Committee with subject committees in this Parliament, perhaps in the way that Environmental Standards Scotland, for example, are often in committees and often speaking to their reports that they make to government, would that be a challenge for you as chief executive in terms of resources?
Bluntly, our devolved funding does not really cover the statutory outputs that we're already delivering across Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. We manage that by drawing on the resources of the whole standing team and the UK-wide team, which serves all 4 UK nations, and then do additional work with a very small number of staff members, like 2 or less, who are dedicated to devolved, all devolved regions. I think part of the answer to this is we would obviously love to do more for Scotland, but it would require the resources to do it. Though, as you know, we regularly come up and give evidence already anyway. We're very happy to do that where we can, but additional resources would help us do more.
Thank you.
Okay, the next questions come from Sarah.
I'm going to ask a couple of questions which follow on from quite a lot of what you've just been talking about. Firstly, both our committee and the Climate Change Committee welcomed the move to quantify abatement in the draft CCP, but we each identified gaps and uncertainties in the modelling. So I want to focus on that a bit. Climate Change Committee said relatively little about the costs and benefits analysis of the plan. So I'm just going to ask you about your assessment of whether the cost and benefit assessments are sufficiently robust and whether the draft climate change plan gives a clear enough signal to households, businesses and investors about where the costs, the savings and the incentives are likely to fall. Because we recommended that more of the underlying data and assumptions that were used in the Scottish Government's modelling of costs and benefits should be published to improve scrutiny. So I'm just going to ask if this is an area where you think that further transparency is required. And if so, what specific information do you think, as the Climate Change Committee, would be most valuable to see in the final climate change plan? I don't know which of you'd like to lead off on my question. Is it Emma?
Take an overview and then hand. I think I'll do an overview and then I'll hand to Emily, because there are some quite significant differences in how we think about costs, and it would be worth touching upon those. So. From our point of view, as you know, when we did our advice, we publish all of our costings and all of our data tables, and you can find all of that available to the public and to parliamentarians. In our advice to Scotland on the carbon budgets, we talked quite a lot about where the funding would come from. So it's where we agree with the Scottish Government is it's broadly an invest to save model. So we're talking about a significant amount of capital investment, largely going into energy technologies, and then you get efficiencies from using more efficient energy technologies across the economy. In Scotland, the savings start outpacing the cost of that investment from around 2043 in our advice to government on the carbon budgets. There are also savings at household level for households that adopt these technologies, and we talked about that in the plan, so long as policy choices are made to enable cheap electricity and electrification coming through. We also, though, talked about how we might finance some early stage technologies. So, for example, in our advice, we assume a polluter pays model for investing in negative emissions technologies and carbon capture and storage. And in that, we're assuming that although we've modelled the cost to the whole economy, we're assuming that the investment for that comes from the aviation sector, who will be the significant polluter in the late period of carbon budgets when you need negative emissions technologies. And similarly, we have assumed that tree planting might be done by, for example, the farming or farming sector, or by landowners with support of government schemes. So it's because it depends on policy choices. We, as an independent statutory body, haven't said this should be public financing, this should be private financing. What we've done is model the whole economy costs and savings, shown that as net, but shown what the upfront costs are and what those savings are. We've also then given it indicative business models or distributed cost impacts, and we have said this is roughly the public private sector split. So you can find that information in our analysis, and we've published it. Some of that is consistent with what the Scottish Government have done, but I think it's fair to say that their costings work is not complete. And I think, as your question implies, they haven't published their full costings data either. So it's difficult for us to say exactly how they've reached some of those figures. I just want to hand over to Emily in case I've missed anything technically that she wants to add.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think you've covered most of it, Emma, I'd say we were quite confused, I'd say, by what was, how the analysis was done on the costing side. It is clear that some bits are missed off, and it's not always clear exactly what that means and what the interpretation is. So, for example, there's no costs on the energy supply side. In our analysis, we see that's very much an invest to save transition as you roll out lower carbon electricity generation. And although that is mostly a sector with reserve powers, that does then lead to an effect on the electricity bills in Scottish homes, where we would expect to see savings as we head towards net zero. So it was quite unclear to us in the buildings case. There were some costs were included, but not costs and benefits. Savings were included, but not for the whole all the carbon budgets. There were similarities in how we've done it. It's this invest to save story. And most of the savings come from the lower running cost of electric vehicles, and that was similar to our analysis. But again, there are differences. So this is the cost compared to a baseline, where actually that baseline already includes quite a few electric vehicles. So we're not actually seeing all the benefits that you get from electric vehicles in those costs. So it was quite hard to unpick. So I would say like more underlying data and methodology would be really helpful going forwards. We would agree with that.
Okay, thanks. That's useful. I suppose the challenge is going from very detailed to actually being able to communicate this stuff. You've talked about, invest to save, and I'm thinking about homes and buildings, how you can invest to save in your electricity, so solar, heat. It's trying to get those trade-offs. So that'd be quite useful to get a feedback on that. My second question was about the annual accountability, and you both talked about that in both your opening remarks and your answers to the convener in her early questions. And we talked about the dashboard concept, because we're not going to get annual emissions targets anymore because you moved to 5 yearly budgets, but how you get that focus, and it's having those annual sectoral and indicator pathways that you've recommended. How do you think we could actually get that strengthened in the climate change plan? Would it be lost if it's not in the climate change plan and then it all gets a bit vague? I think one of you said that the 18-month delay, that could mean we'd be up to 2029 before we start getting actual clear progress. So how would you make a dashboard work so that you'd actually get the publicity and the accountability that the Parliament in the next term could actually focus on?
I think firstly, as you say, we need this data at an annual level. So I think because they're 5 yearly carbon budgets and that's what's been published, that makes sense in the sense that that's the legal target. But we really need, and it's an indicative pathway, it's not a target. It doesn't mean that, if you don't hit that pathway in year one of the carbon budget, then you're not going to make the carbon budget, but it tells you in good time that you need to adjust. So we think it's really key to have that. And without them being in the plan, I think it's quite difficult actually for us to do our job properly, to assess it each year, because we don't know where the plan is saying emissions need to be by sector in that year. So we can determine it from our pathway, but of course that's not the same, and it's a different pathway, so that makes it quite complicated. So this is something that we really think needs to be in the plan. And I think if it's in the plan and then, of course, can be commented on in the monitoring and evaluation framework, that's what brings it out and means that accountability at more of an annual level is possible. But even if the emissions are given in sectoral level, which will help, but there's this 18-month delay, it's these early sign indicators that can really, really help with this. So we track all sorts of indicators. We have a monitoring framework. We track all sorts. And I think, just adding more. So we talked about the rollout of heat pumps. How many heat pumps are we installing each year? How many electric vehicles are on the road? How many new electric vehicles are being sold? But also we track things like and this is something that we do in our progress reports, the the price difference between a new electric vehicle and a petrol car, so that because that's really an early sign of how the transition is going to change as prices fall, where we expect then that the sales to really increase. So there are all sorts of things you can do to track progress and give you a red flag or a green flag depending on where they are, which gives then good time to adjust. So I just think having that detail in the plan is just super key, and then bringing it out to communicate.
So effectively, what you'd like to see is the dashboard in the final plan, or the commitment to it, then a sectoral breakdown so we could monitor progress, which isn't an annual target per se, but it would monitor the rate of progress and then flag challenges. And I think what really stood out was you thought it's broadly okay for the first few years, but the next two programmes really quite concerning in budgets. So I just wanted to pick up, you both mentioned quite a few times low carbon heating. So I'm going to focus on that, and then my colleague Mark, I think, will come in on other topics. But if you take the low carbon heating, heat pumps, solar panels, that's all quite short term. You could do that quite straightforwardly. But presumably heat networks takes a bit more planning. So if we were to get a sectoral breakdown, would it be a mix of the dashboard on heat pumps, solar panels, and then progress on development of heat networks? Because you can't just say, tick the box, we're doing that tomorrow. So how would it break down those kind of different approaches so that you would flag progress and not progress? So that would require the Scottish Government to do a catch-up model. Is that how you'd kind of make it work? Because I'm also thinking about households, benefits and risks, but I'm also thinking about businesses. One of you mentioned supply chains. So that's a key issue in terms of the business sector, to be able to build up so you can technically actually have the kit available to do the installations. What are you thinking?
I think that's right. I think there are different technologies at different stages in development, and there are different things that take longer, need more planning. And so you would have an indicator that fits those sorts of timescales. And I talked about things like costs. I think they're super key. Like if you're monitoring the costs of technologies, that really helps you understand where we think the market's going. Anything on supply chains and etc. and sort of plans are helpful for the longer term things. But yeah, for heat pumps, they're a well-established technology. What we really need to do is see how quickly are they going into homes, and we think that's super important to do annually.
Okay, thanks. No, just thinking that's straightforward, whereas a heat network, all of our councils have got a heat networks plan, but actually implementing it's going to be much more challenging. So I'm going to stop there, thanks, Convener, and I think my colleague Mark was going to go into some of the other
You're taking
sectors.
over the role of the convener, allocating the next question.
No, I've just
bit
been
late
nice
in the
and
day
handing
for
over.
that, Sarah. Mark, I think you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to get a sense of how you think government should be reporting against individual sectors, because it's clear with the climate change plan that I guess there's been some policy choices made in one sector, such as livestock, agriculture, which has then been picked up in the transport sector with higher ambition. I want to get a sense of what your view is of that. So, for example, if you take aviation, is there a credible pathway to net zero for aviation within that particular sector, or is it actually implicit that other sectors are going to have to pick up the slack because politically it's too difficult to talk about demand reduction in aviation? So I'm interested in how you report and analyse potential political trade-offs between sectors. And how we make those transparent, or is your starting assumption that every sector needs to get to net zero, even though that might be politically and practically quite challenging? Yeah, Emma, you want to go?
Yeah, I assume questions about politics are the ones for me to do. So broadly, I suppose the value of an independent body is we aren't making those political trade-offs. So when we give you our advice and when we do the progress reporting, the committee is thinking about where you can physically, technically reduce emissions from the economy to get to that net zero threshold, We look at all of the available technologies, the best evidence for policies that mean those technologies can scale up. Where we don't have technologies, we would look at demand choices, and we look at then negative emissions technologies where we can't see a way to remove the emissions from a sector. We look across all sectors agnostically, and we put the pathway together in that way. In the CCC's advice, we also then cost optimise. So we offer you a balanced pathway, that middle pathway, which shows you what we think the least cost route is to delivering net zero. What we often say, though, in our evidence, and we did this in Scotland, is there are political trade-offs and choices to be made that are not for us to make. Things like, where do the distributed impacts fall? You know, which households? How do you, as politicians, want to target grant schemes or support in which sectors, or within sectors, to, if you think about heating, which households? You can, of course, make different technology choices. We mentioned heat networks earlier. You know, the exact mix of technology is to a certain extent a result of what the Scottish Government chooses to prioritise in partnership with the private sector, and where those technologies are available. And then there are also further political choices which do not sit inside our mandate, which are relevant, though, for this. So, for example, in our advice to the Scottish Government, we talked about, you know, agriculture is important culturally to Scotland as well as economically, and that the agriculture sector and the changes that will occur in how we farm are important to do sensitively on a farm-by-farm basis, to be done thoughtfully, that the government might choose to make different choices to us when we're just looking through an emissions lens. We said the same thing on industrial strategy around, you know, sites like, for example, Grangemouth. You know, there are all the oil and gas sector in Scotland and the heritage of that industry there, and the need for transition of that sector, you know, alongside but outside of any commitment to net zero, and that those choices come with then implications and trade-offs sometimes for climate choices as well. So what we try and do is a very technical, independent analysis. We then often do flag in the narrative of the reports that we give you where there are areas where there might be trade-offs to be made. And lastly, if we think that there are trade-offs, sometimes we'll give you analysis to help you make those choices. So, for example, in the UK-wide advice, we did a piece of distributed impact work where we looked at the impacts across different households of doing 2 different kinds of policy changes and reducing electricity prices. We didn't make a decision about which route was better. We just showed you what the implications would be of each. And so we do that kind of an evidence gathering too, to help you with those choices, but those choices are not for us. That is the difference between what we do and what you do. So hopefully that's been useful. Very lastly, I think some of the most useful work we've done in this cycle is the work we've done directly with citizens and citizens panels. And again, we've published all of that evidence alongside our technical work, because the point of that evidence gathering was to give the public some of those policy trade-offs and ask them about challenges and priorities. And again, we haven't then determined a policy outcome for you from that evidence, but we've given it alongside the technical advice so that it can help you making some of those trade-offs.
Thanks, Michael. Deputy Convener's got some questions for you now.
Thank you. Good morning. I want to maybe pick up in the area of some of the risks that you've identified in your report for the CCP. You've identified significant risk in a couple of areas, particularly around buildings, which has been touched upon so far, and also in the area of agriculture. And you've also flagged up that there is a concern about the areas where overperformance is expected, is that actually there's insufficient contingency within those areas to meet the areas which carry significant risk. You suggest 2 approaches here. One is a change in the modelling, which is being used, and the other area is to develop contingency plans for these areas with the greatest risk. Of the options that you've set out, what would your preferred approach be? Emily.
I think Emily would like to take this question, judging from the level of excitement and hand-waving.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I would like to take this opportunity to talk a bit about some of these issues that you've raised that we think are risky in the plan based on like assumptions that are very uncertain. There are a couple of areas. So the first is in buildings. So we've seen we saw emissions fall actually 18% between 2021 and 2023 in buildings, 1.3 megatons. This was really, as Emma said it in the introduction, really driven by high gas prices driving down demand, but also warmer than average temperatures, so milder winters, meaning that less heating demand. What the climate change plan has done is kind of banked those emissions reductions. Whereas what we would expect is that when you get a cold year and they fluctuate year to year, we're not talking about sort of the climate change and just gradually getting warmer. We're talking about these fluctuations you get year to year that really have quite big changes in emissions from buildings. As we have colder years, which we certainly will do during a 5-year carbon budget, as gas prices ease off and demand goes up, then we would expect emissions from buildings actually to go up. But what the climate change plan has done is banked those emissions reductions. And just for context, that's so 1.3 megatons that they fell over those 2 years. It's quite a big amount, because actually how much in the pathway then emissions fall in buildings is only 0.1 megaton a year over the first 10 years. So you can see that sort of if part of that rebounds back up, you're kind of undoing the progress in the pathway over the first 2 carbon budgets by quite a high proportion. So that is something we really think should be accounted for in the modelling. And the other one is a correction to peatlands and how peatlands are reported in greenhouse gas inventory. There's a correction that's been applied based on emerging research that was commissioned by the Scottish Government from the James Hutton Institute. So great that this research is being done. The research indicates that emissions from peatlands are less than currently reported by greenhouse gas inventory, but there are quite a lot of uncertainty in there. And this peatland correction, when we correct for it, is 1.5 megatons. So that, again, is being assumed it will be in the greenhouse gas inventory over the 2nd and 3rd carbon budgets. But there are some uncertainties in what the level will be. Also, as Emma said in the introduction, the way that it's been done in the pathway doesn't account for the fact that it will also change in the 1990 baseline emissions. So actually, they're sort of what's being assumed in terms of emissions reductions is probably optimistic in that sense, and that it's not included in the baseline. So it's uncertain. We don't know which way the inventory will go. It takes time to get things into inventory, but this is what we're alluding to when we say the overperformance of the pathway compared to the carbon budgets is actually smaller than the size of these sort of highly uncertain factors in the 2nd and 3rd carbon budgets. I mean, our preference would be not to model them such that you're relying on something uncertain. In the land use emissions case, land use inventories do change all the time. They're very uncertain, actually. They move up and down all the time. So if you bank on something where they'll go down, something else might go up. So we would say take more of a conservative approach there and do something where you're not banking on a change. And in the buildings case as well. There's also another methodological case that was highlighted in your report and we very much agree with your recommendation that the delay to the ban on biodegradable municipal waste to landfill, that's been modelled from the beginning of 2025, actually, should be remodelled because of the delay in that ban. So yeah, our preference would be that you sort of model things on a more conservative way, so you're not assuming things, but very much if you're not going to do that, they need to be monitored very closely, and that's where the contingency plans are needed, such that, okay, if this inventory change doesn't go into peatland, what is the plan and when do we need to know it by, such that it's not too late? If buildings emissions do rebound up following warmer than average winters, following high gas prices, what's our contingency, given that's going to affect the carbon budget? So you can take either approach. Our preference would be the former. I think Emma's requesting to speak.
Emily, I think you actually ended up covering what I was going to say, but I suppose to highlight one of the reasons that we keep talking about heat, transport, areas where you can get action now, is that it is clearly a better idea to crack on with delivery where you can make progress and get emissions down, and to do that in every area of the economy that it is to depend on early stage or untested technologies, and then separately not to have delivery plans in place. So I think aside from the overall approach, I think this is why it's really important for us to have those sectoral pathways, clear indicators, policies in place for the sectors where we know we need a lot of action, and it's quite clear what the choices are, because that then does speak to the certainty with hitting your eventual targets, and like much more focus on what can be done now beyond the first carbon budget period would also be just an overarching bit of advice for us to you, that we'd like to see those more detailed delivery plans for the second and third carbon budgets coming forward, and focusing on heat in particular.
Okay, well, that's helpful. Can I ask Emily specifically on the issue of buildings? And you mentioned the way in which the modelling has banked in the reducing energy use due to high gas prices and warmer winters into the figure which the CCP is using at the moment. Are you effectively saying that the model and the approach that's been taken in calculating out the figures for the building emissions is unsustainable?
I don't know who's going for
Well,
that.
I think
sorry,
Emily.
Emily.
Yeah, we've got very similar names.
I couldn't see hands waving. I only saw one of you on the screen, so I apologise.
Yeah, we can start. Yeah, I can wave. Sorry. Yeah. So basically, we don't know for sure what's going to happen to heating demand as gas prices change and come down. Some of the reasons that energy demand, heating demand has gone down could be due to changes in, how you adjust your boiler flow, whether you've draft-proofed your home a bit. Some of it is quite likely to be you're just having a colder home because it's so expensive to heat your home. And these are types of behaviours that we wouldn't want to encourage, right? So it's very hard actually to know how much of that reduction will be sustained. In our modelling, we took an approach to say it could be around half, because some of it may be sustained. UK-wide modelling actually it looks more so that it just completely rebounds back up. It is uncertain, but the modelling in the CCP kind of takes that as a starting point. So we do think that that's quite a risky approach. We would imagine it would rebound, and these things have quite a big effect in emissions. You see a lot of like jumping around in sort of buildings emissions because of this, and the temperature one is also, we do see higher heating demand in colder winters, and it makes sense. And so when we've had 2 mild winters, we don't expect those winters to always be mild going forwards. And so, yeah, we do think that will rebound back up. So obviously we don't have a crystal ball, but we would think that likely emissions will rebound from that. And then that's then going to have to be compensated for by something faster in terms of decarbonising and rolling out heat pumps. And as I said before, actually the level of emissions reductions due to actually decarbonising how we heat our homes in the plan is very, very slow over those first 2 carbon budgets. So it'll take a lot to get back just to sort of counteract that rebound back up.
If I can add to that, there's another way of looking at this, which is aside from the technical issues with the calculation of the CCP, the other side of the coin for us in evaluating progress is, do we think that there are credible policies and plans in place to cover any pathway, whatever it is? And I think on the heat side, we're saying both that we don't think that there are sufficient policies and plans, and that we're not sure about how the pathway has been designed in the CCP. So practically, we don't have the heat and building strategy and delivery plan. It would be good to see that. We'd like to see confirmation that the budget allocation in the Scottish budget for grants for low carbon heating systems comes through, but then there's no funding certainty beyond the 2026-2027 financial year for support for low carbon heating technology, particularly heat pumps. You could look at whether or not there's a plan to improve standards in the private rental sector and social housing. I think around a third of new build homes in Scotland have low carbon heating systems. What's the plan to scale that up? And then I think I wanted to add this to the question about how we track different kinds of technologies in different sectors in Scotland. In Scotland, in particular for heating, tenements are a really significant difference to the UK as a whole. About 25% of the housing stock, and a third of those are pre-1919, and they're complicated both because of collective ownership and the legal arrangements in place for people living in tenements, but also because they're often pre-1919, so older in terms of the fabric. They are the kind of building that we think might not be done with individual heat pumps and with heat networks. And so there you're again looking for, as was asked in the question, credible plans for the deployment of heat networks that do take time relative to putting in a heat pump. So you can, both in terms of how the pathway has been calculated, but also in terms of what we can see in policy, we are, flagging heat as a risk.
Well, that's very helpful. Can I maybe just stick with the issue of contingency planning, because you've recommended that the Scottish Government look at some contingency planning in areas where they lack agency, or which would largely fall into areas of reserve policy, so ETS, CCS, etc., the electric vehicle mandate, etc. These are areas that the Scottish Government doesn't have control over. And of course, energy prices as well. Is it realistic for the Scottish Government to be expected to draw together contingency plans for areas that are reserved, that they are unable to identify or understand the pace and nature of how policy will be taken forward by the UK Government in these areas?
So I think one of the differences between our advice and then the CCP is there is actually less dependence in our advice on areas which are reserved, because we have less dependence on negative emissions technologies. We have got greater action, or at least clearer action in heat decarbonisation, which is largely devolved. We, in the progress report, as I said at the beginning, we're saying 58% of the actions in the forward carbon budgets are coming from devolved rather than from reserved areas of the economy. So I think that is something to emphasise, that the CCP does, even as design, put more emphasis on reserved areas of the economy than we would in our advice. And that's for the reason you described, which is that we try to make sure we are giving advice where we can be sure about delivery as much as possible, and go for technologies and policies which we have seen in evidence work in other countries, UK-wide, or that we believe will work in Scotland. In terms of where there are contingencies or areas where there needs to be shared working between Westminster and Scotland, I think some of this is about how politics work, which is your job more than mine, but I'd say being able to quantify exactly what those risks are, say where you need the support of the UK government. The UK reports all its emissions reductions collectively as in its international obligations. There is a incentive for all of the nations of the UK to work together in that regard, and I think it would be helpful to discussions to be able to say how much you're dependent on working with Westminster on those things, and in turn, as I've said, for example, the UK as a whole is very dependent on Scotland for some areas of UK-wide decarbonisation, in particular tree planting, where 38% of trees UK-wide for the UK-wide carbon budgets are going to be planted in Scotland, because they're of the available land for doing that in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. So it's got to be a partnership on some areas. In our advice, we have tried to minimise the contingency on depending on reserved areas of the economy. Given where the CCP is, I think quantifying that as much as possible and being able to work out what you need for negotiating with Westminster is a good idea. How the politics of that goes forward is, I think, more of a political question.
Okay, thanks. I do think there are some challenges here, though, for the Scottish Government to bring together credible contingency plans, given the level of uncertainty they may have around areas of reserve policy area, which I think, as your own calculation, makes up about 40, just over 40% of what has to be achieved in the CCP. Can I just, can you remind me, what recommendations did you make to the UK Government in their and your advice to them on the actions that they should take in order to make sure that they're taking forward sufficient action to support the other nations of the UK? We have a whole chapter in the 7th Common Budget on contingencies, which will include some of the things that we've talked about for Scotland, which are UK-wide, including the development of removals technologies, carbon capture, the ZEV mandate, the emissions trading scheme. So I would refer you to that chapter in the advice in terms of similar approaches. When it came to making recommendations and Devolved in particular, we have drawn out areas in the advice to the UK government on the 7th Carbon Budget where you would need joint working with Scotland and the other nations of the UK, and I've flagged some of them here. For example, tree planting, for example, on electricity generation, acknowledging that, for example, Scotland has been the place where we've developed a significant amount of the offshore wind, which is then responsible for UK-wide emissions reduction as well as reduction in Scotland. So we have, in that advice, signalled to government where they need to do more joint working, and regularly, if we're asked for advice on something that is a UK-wide issue like the ETS, flag the need for that to be a shared conversation. Stepping back from that, I noticed in your report responding to the CCP that you mentioned that there is a regular ministerial meeting across the devolved nations and the UK government. Structures like that are obviously a good idea, and we regularly point to the need for structures across government, within Whitehall, but also across the governments of the UK to make sure that we're aligned on the UK-wide emissions reduction, UK climate risk and adaptation, and then making sure that devolved governments are supported with their own climate change acts and plans. Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much, Michael. Douglas, you've got some questions.
Yes, Convener, I'm going to move on to public and business engagement now. So while both the Climate Change Committee and this committee highlight the need for clear, trusted information, we place a focus on enabling community-led and place-based action as part of that delivery. So, Emma, if I can maybe ask you, where do you think community-level delivery fits in within the wider system changes that we need for net zero?
Thank you for the question. So we look at it as part of our advice. I mean, the first thing to say on questions like this is our mandate is a national one. So we tend to be looking at across the whole system or across the economy or across sectors. And as much as possible, we are agnostic about the exact delivery route, private sector, public sector, and at what level, because some of that does come with a political choice about where you're allocating funds or resources. That said, in a lot of the evidence we look at, if we can see that a place-based or community-led approach has been very effective, we will draw it out. And just to pull out two things in particular, for example, in the agricultural advice, both UK-wide and for Scotland, we talk about the need in the 4th land use strategy, but also in the UK government's forthcoming land use framework, to have a sensitive, I think we described it as a kind of almost farm-by-farm approach in looking at how you actually implement some of the changes in agriculture. That's because when you look across the whole system, the actual distributed impacts of that or how you deliver it on the ground can be quite different. So you don't want allocating a change for an entire region that wouldn't work for an individual farm. So we do that. We often commission separate analysis. In that case, that information I'm talking about came from a separate piece of work done for us by the NFU and farming stakeholders, talking about how delivery might work in practice. We have done similar work with say business groups or community groups on how delivery might work. We're producing work on how local authorities might interpret and use our overarching plan. The other way we think about this is in flagging whether a particular risk to particular areas, and I've talked about some of them already, but in the Scottish advice, we obviously talk about the North Sea in terms of the transition and what that means for Aberdeen and the need for just transition and kind of thoughtful transition plans, similarly for industrial clusters. So thinking very carefully about Grangemouth, Project Willow, thinking about Project Acorn. So where there is specific place-based bits of evidence or advice, we often refer to those. In Wales, we did similarly for Port Talbot, for example. And then lastly, we do, within the main advice, look at questions of distributed impact, which sometimes can be place-based, but are also highly individual. And we do that quantitatively with a distributed impact model, which we did for the UK-wide advice, but also we do it with social research by sitting with the Citizens Assembly and talking about how delivery might work, what they think are the trade-offs, what sort of actors they'll listen to, and again, we offer that advice as well. So although the mandate is national and broad and often across the whole system, where we think it's appropriate, we do try and give layered advice further down.
Mentioned North East of Scotland and obviously people in the oil and gas sector that are affected by some of the changes. So from the Climate Change Committee's perspective, what does effective engagement with those groups look like in practice?
Well, I think if you talk to the team, the work that they found really interesting and of real value in pulling together our advice in Scotland included going up to Aberdeen with some of the unions and meeting some of the workers up there and talking to them directly about the transition and talking to them about the situation that they're already experiencing as the basin declines. And our chair, Nigel Topping, went back to Aberdeen just last week and talked to some of those same groups about what they think now that they've seen the carbon budget advice and some of the plans from Scotland. Look, it is the industrial planning piece of this and the just transition piece of this doesn't sit with us as a statutory body. It's with in Scotland the Just Transition Commission and others. But I think we would, in partnership with them, recognise the need to bring people with us on this transition, to have particular plans in place for places that are going to have to do significant change. We flag Aberdeen as one of those places in our advice. You know, we would like to see thoughtful approaches to training and redeployment and development and so on with those communities. And to really, if you look at the advice that we've given, we talk about specifically Aberdeen and the work that we did up there and what the recommendations were, having spoken to those workers and to the unions. And of course, you've had evidence from Just Transition Commission. So I think for us, it's not entirely in our mandate. We recognise that it's important. We really enjoyed going up to Aberdeen and meeting those workers and being able to offer some thoughtful advice on it in our own report. And we'd also very much signal that the Just Transition Commission and the unions and others are the people to go to for more detailed plans, apart from to recognise that the government does need them. Just, I suppose, one thing to say, we haven't found that that community was opposed to the idea of change. Regardless of net zero, the basin has 75% declined since 1999. It will decline further regardless of plans for net zero. They are aware that there will have to be a change. They do want early intervention and support. And if you think what we said to Wales about Port Talbot, which was there was a complete failure to plan for something that everyone could see coming, not because of net zero, because of rising electricity prices, pressure from competition, pressure from global trade. If you don't engage early and have plans in place early, you don't get good decarbonisation, you get consequences for your key industries. And I think that is something that we are very happy to say needs to change, and we would like to see significant and early intervention.
And Emma, I know this is not in your remit in terms of transition plans, but do you... you almost said it there, but so does something need to change faster in terms of making sure that communities are aware of what the consequences are, where they can change and play their part? Because I feel a lot of these communities are pushing back against net zero because they're seeing things that are done to them and they are not seeing a future for themselves.
communication across the piece, as I said in the beginning, is something that we're really keen to see governments do more of. And I say governments, but it could also be governments enabling community groups and other trusted actors to do more of. We find in our own citizens panels, which have been a new thing for us in this cycle of carbon budgets, that people are not opposed to action, or actually quite readily, once they have seen the science or the evidence, will move to understanding that something needs to be done. The kind of core themes that come out are, as you say, that they want to be partners in that change. They want to be able to give their opinion. And they want a sense of fairness that comes out quite often across the economy, a sense of vulnerable people being looked after, clarity about why particular trade-offs and choices are being made. The polling in Scotland and your own social attitudes tracker says that 83% of the Scottish public know that climate change is happening. They want something done about this. That comes out when we speak to communities, even communities where there is significant change, but they do want that dialogue, and they want deliberative dialogue, and they want it early. Just lastly, on oil and gas, my background is the energy sector. I think presenting a change in how we consume fossil fuels as a choice to do with climate is not an accurate reflection of the story of the energy transition. Fundamentally, internationally now, there's more money going into clean technologies than there are into fossil fuels. These are very energy efficient technologies. There is a race for them internationally. Battery prices are dropping, electric technologies prices are dropping. And yes, of course, that is about emissions reduction, but it is also about a big energy transition of the kinds of energy transition we've had before, from moving from coal to gas and now gas to electricity. And I think those pressures, as well as the fact that the basin was mature, will mean change for those communities. And they do know that when we speak to them, to answer your question. That is not something they're not aware of. What they're looking for is a plan for that transition. And also, just lastly, place is obviously important to people. And I think this is the same with farming. When we talk to the farming community, they want to farm. So it's about making sure that things are not being taken, but that there are plans for a way forward that can be positive for places which have got a proud legacy of a different industry.
I think we're going to come back onto fossil fuels later, but I just wanted to ask just now. So when the Climate Change Committee recommends that the Scottish Government should work with the UK Government to communicate a clear vision and provide trusted information on low carbon choices, what specific actions do you envisage in that?
I realise this sounds like a public servant dodge, but actually I do think that is for politicians to decide. You are the people that talk to constituents and the public, and will have a better idea of exactly the right thing to do there than we will. I can only speak from the experience of our evidence collection, which is that we have found those deliberative processes with the public really useful. Having time for the public to ask questions, to debate trade-offs, and to have open dialogue has been a really positive thing for us. And I hope that information and that evidence has been useful to you. How to run a big public communications campaign and at what level and with which audience, I think that is a job for politicians more than it is for us.
Okay.
Emily has a strong view.
Well, as long as it can be a brief, strong view, because I'd like to just pause for a minute before we go on to the next bit. So, yeah. Emily, briefly.
It's a very brief, strong view, and it's not actually a direct answer to the question. It's just that the Scottish Climate Survey highlights that only 21% of respondents thought a gas boiler to heat pump was among 4 of the most effective things that a household could do for climate change. And we know that moving to an EV and a heat pump are actually the 2 really biggest things that it can do. So I think it's just there's a disconnect between what households think is a big impact and what really is, and it's usually that they think it's all about recycling, and less about these shifts to these low carbon technologies. But I don't have an answer to the best way to communicate that.
Okay, well, we can pause on EVs because we're about to come to them. So what I'm going to suggest is it's 10:31. We'll start again at 10:36, and then we will be ending this session at 11:30. So if you could. We'll suspend the meeting literally for 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee meeting. And the next question comes from Mark. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. So I wanted to turn to the issue of electric vehicles. There's obviously quite a heavy dependence on electric vehicles within the climate change plan. As you've just said, Emily, it's perhaps one of the biggest changes that individuals can make to reduce carbon emissions in terms of technological approaches. I mean, you've stated that there are credible plans in the CCP for electric vehicles, but also note that there's not a lot of detail in the way of specific Scottish Government incentives and programmes to support EV uptake. So I want to understand why you're confident that the assumptions in the climate change plan around EVs are solid and credible. Emily.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, that's right. So it is very dependent on the transition to EVs. Transport's now the highest emitting sector in Scotland, and in the plan, 40% of required emissions reductions over the first carbon budget come from the transport sector. This is actually in line with our modelling. So the sort of trajectory for EV rollout is in line with our modelling. We do think it's a sector that can move rapidly. So let me just talk a little bit about that. We say there's credible plans for a big chunk of it, but we do say that there are risks as well. So in the year to September 2025, number of EVs on the road increased by 38%. So we know in Scotland, they're increasing fast, and there's strong policy in the ZEV mandate, and there's been targeted funding and support in Scotland. What we're seeing, and we're monitoring this UK-wide, is the price premium of an electric vehicle compared to internal combustion engine really falling. So it was 37% more expensive in 2023, dropped to 24% in 2024, and as of September 2025 was 19%. We're really seeing it start to fall. Already for many drivers, they're cheaper to run and maintain, and the second-hand market's starting to get cheaper and cheaper. So what we're seeing is yes, it's still fairly low numbers, but we do expect them to really accelerate, and we expect price parity to be coming soon, depending on the vehicle size. And that then will really flip, and we see these S-curve dynamics where we really just see that the new technology is taking over. They're good technologies, they're efficient technologies, and we have seen progress in charge points. So a 34% increase in 2024 to over 6,000 in Scotland. So that target was met 2 years early. The distribution of them does vary, and we have noted that satisfaction in them is low. So that sort of thing, these enabling factors do need to be looked at. So what we do have is some risk in the early take-up that's assumed in the pathway. We have highlighted that there is risk there, but we think that it may be a little bit behind, but it's not that it's going to be really behind, and it will catch up. Is our prediction because of these sort of the economics of it. The other thing to note is that there may well be some underreporting of the number of electric vehicles in Scotland. Because of the way that it's done with company vehicles registered, both cars and vans registered in England but driven in Scotland, might not be being captured, so sales may be higher than is being reported. That's something that Scottish Government is looking into now to try and understand. But we do say there is some risk in the earlier days and some risk going forwards, because it is ambitious. It's an ambitious trajectory for sure, and sort of a lot of reliance on it. But we looked at it, and there is some risk in some of it, but we really do think that these sales are continuing to go up, and it will anyway start to really eat into emissions soon.
Certainly look positive, and the cost is definitely coming down in terms of purchasing a vehicle. But I'm interested about the cost of electricity, and particularly charging. So I can remember 5-6 years ago, charging at public charge point was free. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a driveway at home, you can get on EV tariff and you can charge, I think, about 8p per kilowatt hour. So again, very, very low cost. But if you go to a public charger in some places, it's up to 60 pence per kilowatt hour. And I'm just, would be interested in your reflections on that charging regime, because it does seem that there are some companies now that are effectively profiteering. The cost of electricity at home, basic tariff 28 pence a kilowatt hour. How can you then justify 60 pence a kilowatt hour? And these do seem to be real world considerations that people will make when deciding whether they can switch to an EV, about the accessibility of cheaper charging. So I'm wondering to what extent you're factoring that in, and could there be a role here for Competitions and Markets Authority, for example, to look at the price of electricity or any other aspect?
So, I mean, I guess I'll say to the fact that we're factoring it in. We know that there are some people that don't have off-street parking and can't charge at home, and that is, the benefits of EVs are just not being seen to the same extent at all by those people, and that's something that we definitely recognise. The cross-pavement charging grant pilot, we think is something really positive, because then you can get more and more people that are able to access these cheaper tariffs, and when you can access them, you pointed out, you can really get incredibly cheap rates. I think the thing, I mean, Emma might want to come into this a bit on the costs as well, on the cost of charges. I think the thing is that as you get more and more of them, hopefully the costs will come down. I mean, we don't have any evidence of profiteering, but it is definitely true that there are these big differences and in cost, and we think that is something that we should really be looking at. We would definitely agree with that. I don't know if you want to add anything, Emma, or not.
Yeah, I think decisions like, is this a CMA issue, is not one for us as a statutory body, though I'm sure others are looking at this and would have made recommendations to you. What is for us is whether or not we think that charging is a barrier to the delivery of emissions and a risk in the plans. Just to say, as Emily said, that's factored in. So we look at how much is on street versus off street parking and making our recommendations on what's feasible in terms of a deployment of electric vehicles. So it's factored in that context. We've also, in the citizens panel evidence, some of our social research and some of the evidence from other countries noted that difference in charging, and said there is a, given that the public themselves have said that fairness is important, and that balance between who has access to off-street and on-street charging, that is something that is notable in that context, that if you think there's a distributed unfairness there, that would be something to look at. And then lastly, I think what is important also to say is that cheap electricity and cheap charging is part of what makes the rollout of electric vehicles beneficial for costs in the economy overall and costs for households. So, as Emily said, one of the indicators we're tracking in terms of the uptake of electric vehicles is absolutely that capital cost of investment. And we know that capital cost is itself a barrier to deployment. But for things like leasing arrangements, financing, household savings, and economy savings on fuel costs, you do need a cheap electricity price. And that is not just about the price being charged to the consumer at a charge point. It's also about the price of electricity on the bill for people who are charging at home. And we've managed to get through almost an entire session without mentioning that cheap electricity is something that we think is a underpinning essential for a lot of emissions reduction, appreciating that so much of that is reserved to Westminster, but is important for Scotland's rollout of these electric technologies too. And over half emissions reduction in the carbon budget advice is coming from electrification. So cheap electricity is really important, however you're charging your vehicle.
I mean, it's clear that cheap electricity is available, but it's only available at night. And that's the problem that we have with EV charging. People don't have access to that personal tariff, that EV tariff. Then they're really stuck using public charges. Do you think there should be a cap on the price of EV charging at public charges?
I think these are policy decisions because they involve trade-offs and choices across the economy, and they are for policymakers. I think, as I've said, what we flagged is questions around fairness matter to citizens and how you think about net zero policy as policymakers. And also there do need to be cheap and available services for charging your vehicle, running your heat pump in your home. And that is a mix of how government allocates policy costs on the electricity bill. It could mean reforms to wholesale electricity prices across the whole of the market. It could be about looking at the market arrangements for things like on-street charging and how that industry functions. It could also be about making sure that the energy retail market is able to offer the sorts of services and tariffs that you're talking about for those people that can charge at home, or for everyone that has a electric heating system in future, which is about, you know, cheap electricity different times of day, being able to do things like load shifting, being able to really make the most of these fundamentally more efficient and cheap energy technologies, because we believe that, you know, if you have those in place at household level, people stand to save money relative to a fossil fuel counterfactual, but it can only enable that if the price of the input fuel is as cheap as it should be.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to stay on electric vehicles, but I'm going to move away from cars and talk more about HGVs. But just making the observation that, you know, as a farmer, I look at tractors nowadays, and the thought of putting batteries on them would probably convince me that they could never go into a field because they'd sink. But on the basis of HGVs, which go on the road, we've heard from the industry that the proposals to move HGVs to electric vehicles are probably unachievable in the medium term. Not only price per unit, 3 times the cost of a diesel unit at the moment, and a lot of small operators just couldn't afford that, but also the fact that the vehicles sit idle for a huge amount of time, recharging to be able to carry out their work. So economically, they're not viable because of the price per mile that the HGV drivers get is pretty minimal anyway. So what about drop-in fuels? Do you accept that there's a place for them, because HGVs are not going to go electric in the timescale that the government and you might like? Emily, I think, was quicker, and Emma sort of looked at you thinking, well, she can answer that. So you're off, Emily.
Yeah, so I would say in our modelling we do have some biofuels as a transitional, you know, as a transition, it's a sort of transitional fuel. We know in bio is a scarce resource, and we have to look across the economy. It's also, you know, we need to use it where it's most beneficial in terms of emissions reductions and where there aren't alternatives. But we do see a role for it as a transitional fuel as we work towards electrification, and recognise that there is some difficulties in HGVs, and that it is more expensive, the upfront costs are more expensive, and may well need some support as well as the regulation that's being consulted on. So, yeah, I think Emma's also...
I'm just going to push back on some difficulties. What we've heard from the industry is in the short to medium term, the targets on them for electric vehicles are unobtainable. And does that just mean some difficulties? It's slightly more than that, isn't it, Emily?
I mean,
it's a great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is something where we think we may well need support for this transition, and I think there are some difficulties. It is difficult. It's a transition that we do think there is some risk in, and as I've said, we do see drop-in fuels as something that can be used as transition, but it must be seen as a transition. We are transitioning. We think the end game is electric HGVs.
Mm.
Electric for tractors as well.
I was at the NFU conference last week talking about electric tractors. I don't know if we've discussed this before, but I live in a rural area, so I see the size of tractors you're talking about. I think if you think about how we put together the advice, if you can see an electric equivalent just because of the nature of the cost drop in batteries, their improved efficiencies, the sorts of machines we can now put them in, and the applications we're using them for. And if you look at the global context for electricity supply, you would take the bet on an electric alternative where you can see one that can scale up. That said, as Emily said, if we can't see that as a plausible, scalable alternative, we have used alternative fuels across the carbon budget advice. So, you know, we've talked about it, but over half of Scottish emissions are from clean electricity. That means the other half are from some combination of alternative fuels, demand changes, and other. In the UK-wide advice, it's similar. And so we use a mix of drop-in fuels, biofuels, but also we look at hydrogen. We've looked at other low-carbon fuels and how you might produce them. as Emily's saying, in the long run, what happens is either you think that the battery or electric equivalent eventually catches up to that transition fuel, or there is a limited feedstock because of when you look across the whole economy, what other sectors need to use the land for say, in the case of biofuels, or for where we need to use things like hydrogen for other areas of the economy where there is really no clear alternative. And you know, in that world, I'd think about things like cement. So that's what we do. Very, in short, you know, small vehicles are very, very clearly going fully electric. And then as you come to more complex vehicles, including large tractors, we've got alternative fuels in as a alternative, and we flagged it as risk. In terms of how the industry thinks and feels about actually delivering that change, one thing that we say in the Scottish advice that we didn't say in the UK is the recognition that freight and logistics in Scotland look a bit different to UK-wide. A lot of these firms are small, they're SMEs, they own 3 vehicles or less, we think, on average. That requires a different delivery roadmap for small companies. That will mean thinking about different access to capital and how you finance that change. So I completely understand why they're signalling those risks. It is, in terms of technical delivery, we think electrification is the way forward. In terms of how the industry delivers that and the policies and support that they need to get that done, that is something for the Scottish Government to have a real clear delivery roadmap for. And then just separately, we do a lot of work with that industry. Logistics UK is one of the trade bodies that we speak to regularly. We are always happy to hear from industry about where they've got constraints, so we can think about that in our own advice as well.
Okay. Emma, I'll come back to this at the end, because it's fine making recommendations and seeing the way forward and then passing out how it's to be costed and paid for to somebody else. It always gives me concern when that's the plan. But anyway, we'll come back to that. Douglas, you're next with your questions.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Moving on to waste now. So this committee have asked the Scottish Government to review figures across waste and energy chapters of their plan in light of the delayed enforcement of the landfill ban, and relatedly to consider whether the energy from waste emissions are likely to peak in 2026. So has the Climate Change Committee considered the impact of that delay on emissions, and what is a credible baseline for energy from waste in your opinion? Well, it looks like Emily's coming in.
Yeah, so I would say we very much agree with your recommendation that this needs to be updated in the modelling. And I think even something that we saw was that I think the modelling actually includes the ban to have already been in effect during 2025. So we do highlight that. So I think very much in terms of for waste, what that means in the modelling is that there's more in the landfill and the emissions that come from that, but less being diverted to energy from waste because it's still in the landfill. When the ban comes into effect, it'll be more going into energy from waste. So it's about where the emissions are counted. So it's not that they're counted in different sectors, and they are different. So the sources of emissions are different in the different places. So this is a methodological change that we would very much agree with your recommendation should be made. And just more generally, we are quite concerned with the rise in emissions from energy from waste, in that it is, you know, there's risk there. We flagged that as risk, as something that there's a couple of things to say. Emissions from energy from waste, actually, I don't think have included all plants so far. So actually, they're probably underestimated, and really it relies on connecting to CCS and having the sort of, you know, the infrastructure, etc. there. So we've flagged that as a significant risk.
So do you think, in terms of climate capture going forward, do you think that will be available in the near time for energy from waste plants across the board?
So my understanding, I think it was 2032 in the plan that they had. I'd have to double check that. And we do think that that's at risk. So this is something, you know, what we have flagged is that the planning requirements could be clearer to ensure that all energy from waste sites will have a viable route to connect to CCS. They should only be built where CCS viability can be demonstrated, and that there are proposals to connect to CCS, so that sort of de-risks that in that sense. So obviously this depends on the Acorn project, and there are risks there that we've flagged. So this is something that we would very much think we'd need to keep an eye on. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to energy supply now. And there is a difference between yourselves and the Scottish Government, I believe, in terms of Peterhead Power Station. Now, I think the Climate Change Committee are of the opinion that Peterhead, the new Peterhead Power Station, shouldn't go ahead. Was that correct?
So I wouldn't say it's that we think it shouldn't go ahead. Our modelling, I mean, Emma might want to come into this as well. The way we do our modelling, technologies are deployed at a plant level for least cost GB-wide system, and it's influenced by a range of factors like relative electricity demand, generation from other sources, network constraints, etc. We don't look sort of at a sort of project viability, etc., like that. And so, very much if Peterhead 2 goes ahead and connect, we have CCS, gas CCS, which we very much model as part of our GB-wide system, then that is still a low carbon production of electricity, and that's perfectly viable route for decarbonisation in Scotland. So I don't think we should take those differences as sort of a recommendation on anything on Peterhead. That's just how our modelling. How it came out in our modelling.
So just to clarify, so your modelling would assume if Peterhead 2 goes ahead, CCS would be there to capture, obviously, the emissions. So it would be almost a zero emissions power station. Is that correct? Is that why there's a slight difference?
We don't have it as an unabated plan in the pathway. So there is an assumption that you would need that project to be connected to CCUS infrastructure. If it goes ahead, that would be a recommendation because of the impact on emissions otherwise. But as Emily's saying, we don't do plant by plant analysis in that way. And just to pull back on why that is, our job is to look across the whole economy, or in this case, the whole energy system, and make a cost-based recommendation on the overall mix. And that gives us an output in our energy modelling, which assumes that Peterhead or a similar size plant isn't there. But when you look at actual delivery and decisions that governments make, there may be very specific reasons to go ahead with plants, including perhaps it's connected to an industrial cluster and there's a good reason to do it for those industrial reasons, or for wider emissions reduction reasons, if you think it's essential to getting a CCUS infrastructure away, for example, that are about delivery and delivery choices that we can't analyse because, again, they require particular trade-offs across the economy or across sectors. You're thinking about a wider set of evidence than we're looking at for emissions reduction purposes. So when I saw your report in response to CCP, it's good to have an opportunity to clarify that we're not making a specific recommendation on Peterhead in our advice. That's absolutely not what the committee was doing there.
Okay, that is helpful. Can I just ask now, what's the Climate Change Committee's view on the future of oil and gas production in the North Sea? Should it go ahead, or should it be an accelerated decline?
We haven't looked at it for the purpose of setting the carbon budgets, because this is a technicality, though carbon budgets are new in Scotland, so I will repeat this technicality. We emissions accounting for the purpose of setting carbon budgets are territorial, because North Sea oil and gas is literally offshore. It's not caught as part of that emissions accounting framework, so we haven't considered it in how we set the advice here. So the last advice that the committee gave on North Sea oil and gas was a separate piece of advice to the Secretary of State some years ago. We haven't looked at it as a question since then. What we have done in the advice is say there is this energy transition happening across the Scottish economy that will affect oil and gas demand, and we can see that the North Sea basin is in decline, and we recognise the work of the North Sea Transition Authority, which reflects a further decline. And for that reason, because of our interest in place-based approaches, which were mentioned earlier, and the sense that we got back from the Citizens' Assembly of talking to affected communities and talking to workers and getting ahead of where there are particularly changing communities, we have flagged that we think the Scottish Government should be specifically looking at Aberdeen, but that's as far as we've gone in the advice.
So just to clarify there, so domestic production of oil and gas doesn't play any impact on the emissions figures. Is that what you said, Emma? Because it was offshore?
Yeah, it has some implications on the inventory. Now, I'll ask Emily to come in on this if I slightly mangle the methodology. But there is some implications on when we look at imports separately. We try and give a kind of sense of what imported emissions are doing, and imported oil and gas would be part of that calculation, and therefore there's some relevance to how much we're using domestic production for that. And then we have a chapter in the 7th Carbon Budget Advice that's UK-wide, where we think about fuel supply more generally, including that balance in import and export, and it comes in a bit in there, but it is not. And then separately, we would treat the emissions from some of the supply chain from North Sea oil and gas, where it's pertinent to territorial emissions, in our industrial analysis. So things like refining, for example, they're included where appropriate in the industrial sector calculations. But what we don't do is look at the North Sea as a whole and the emissions from production, because they're offshore in the most part. And also we don't look at, for example, the impact on, or the trade-off or the counterfactual of more or less imported or domestic consumption of oil and gas.
Even though they're offshore, but still in UK waters, they don't count towards our emissions.
So they count towards UK-wide emissions.
Yes.
So in the Scotland carbon budgets include, as Emma said, some emissions in terms of the operation of terminals to manage the import and onshoring of oil and gas, leakage from gas from pipelines, etc. But any onshore production, but some of the offshore production are not in scope for Scotland. They're kind of counted as another category, so they include in UK-wide. It's quite technical and a bit confusing.
Yeah, we'd be very happy to come and talk you through this in more detail if it's something of particular interest, because it's about how the accounting works. So we have thought it through as we are meant to do under the various acts and have done up to that mandate, but we haven't considered it as a separate question in the way that I think sectors would. But I would just to draw back again, this is something we get quite often when we're talking to particular industry groups, because and I come from the private sector, most industries will think about their sector and like write down their supply chain as a kind of a sector independent from the rest of the economy, because we're looking across the whole economy. Sometimes we treat emissions in quite a different way to how sectors or parliamentarians might think about things. You know, for example, that's why there's a difference in our analysis from how the government thought about things like energy from waste, because we've treated waste emissions in a waste section of our analysis, and they've treated it in a energy section. I think I've got that the right way around. So there are these. Sometimes it's a kind of technical choice about how we have to put the accounting together, because of how then we report up to the UN and other bodies and kind of best practice for emissions accounting frameworks. But I appreciate that can be quite different from how you're thinking through the issue. So we're happy to come and talk that through if that would be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Camilla.
I'll leave you to take them up on that, Douglas, if you want greater clarity on that. So we'll move to, I think Mark's got a couple of questions. Can I just remind you that we've got about 20 minutes left, so I'm just keen to make sure that I don't exclude Kevin, who's sat very quietly waiting his turn.
Thanks, Convener. Okay, so I'd like to move to negative emissions technologies, and the assumption within the climate change plan, the draft plan, is that there'll be, I think, about 12 megatons of emission reduction into that, I think, 3rd or 4th carbon budget, which is double what you've recommended. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I mean, is it really credible to be, you know, I guess kind of doubling down on that emissions reduction? And what do you see as the key kind of risks and contingencies with that, particularly given that, you know, some of the main kind of sources of carbon that were going to be fed into Acorn at Grangemouth and Mossmorran are no longer going to be feeding in, and there are some questions about delivery in relation to Acorn. Emily?
Yes. So yeah, thanks for the question. So I think maybe if I just set out a bit the difference in how we've approached it. So in our advice, we consider NETs, negative emissions technologies, UK wide in the first instance, because it's like how much do we need in the UK to get to net zero in the UK? And it's very much about, and as Emma talked about before, we have a polluter pays principle here. So it's mostly aviation emissions that are being offset by these technologies. And this is a policy choice, but we would in our modelling, we assume that that's the aviation industry that then pays for those. But we have basically what's needed then UK wide to get to net zero, and then where they sit within the UK depends on a number of factors. So, for example, we have about 25% of our direct air capture, carbon capture and storage in Scotland because there's abundant renewable generation. So we sort of define it in that way. For the CCP, our understanding, but I really think there's lacking detail here, which I'll come to in a minute, is it's more of a bottom-up feasibility approach of what could be done. What we don't understand is how that aligns with UK-wide plans for nets, because what we see this as we said, if it's a polluter pays principle by 2050 in the UK that's going to be paid for by the aviation industry, for example, like why would they be particularly in Scotland versus other parts of the UK? And that's really about making Scotland an attractive location for nets. And so what we don't know is how joined up that is, both in terms of in 2050, 2045, but also that ramp up in the carbon budgets. How does the amount of nets that is being assumed in the Scottish draft climate change plan align with what's being assumed in UK-wide carbon budget plans? And is there a link up there? Has there been discussions there? Is that what's being assumed in the UK plans? And that's what what we don't understand. What we really think is needed is so that it says by the end of 2026 there'll be a route map to deployment at scale by 2040. We need to see that before we can sort of really make a judgment on, is this feasible? We've definitely flagged it as a significant risk. As you've said, it's something that goes beyond what we have in our pathway. And in terms of what that means comparing to other sectors, there's a lot more in negative emissions technologies. There is less in buildings, and we've talked about that, although the endpoint by 2045 will have to be more ambitious in Scotland. There's much less in the near term and not as much even by carbon budget 3, so really have to accelerate, and less in agriculture. So, we do see this as a significant risk, and it was a decision that was made.
Can I just intervene? I mean, it's useful context what you're explaining, but there really is only one negative emissions technology proposal that's on the table at the moment, and that's Acorn, which is in track 2 at the moment, and there are concerns about that in terms of deliverability and risks. I am interested in your thoughts on that, and particularly in relation to the plans. So, we had the Cabinet Secretary in front of the committee a few weeks ago who said that if CCUS doesn't develop at the level that the Climate Change Committee has modelled in its calculations, that committee would have to go back to its assumptions and provide additional advice. So in terms of the government having a plan B if Acorn doesn't materialise, the government is very clearly here saying it's for yourselves in the Climate Change Committee to think that one through. So I am interested, if Acorn doesn't happen, what do you see as the contingency plan going forward? What would that plan B look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's whether it doesn't go, whether there's delays versus whether, there's questions on delays as well, because there's carbon budgets. So I think it is really majority, as you said, of removals is in Acorn. There are other sort of things like enhanced weathering and biochar, which are a much lower level in our modelling, which we don't know actually in the climate change plan what the balance is of the different removals. But we would say, looking at the other sectors, that certainly in buildings, which we've really pointed out, that this could be going faster, and we think it should be going faster. So there's just all of this is putting more and more reliance on negative emissions technologies. So it's kind of the contingency for that is really monitoring what's happening in all of these sectors. Is it ramping up? Do we think, when we see this route map, do we think that that is going to happen? There is, and we've flagged it as risk. We definitely think that Acorn is at risk, and I think, you know, we would have to think about it, but also because as you've said, there's more reliance in the climate change plan than by quite a way than our plan on negative emissions technologies. Then I think, you know, obviously Scottish Government's pathway would need to look at it as well.
I think the difficulty for us in this committee is we are trying to understand what the implications of Acorn not going ahead would mean, and you've flagged up one sector which has been difficult for the government to make progress on, and that's buildings. Are we saying that you're going to get, you know, 12 megaton reduction in emissions from buildings, and that's the way forward? And if you're not able to kind of point to what our plan B looks like at this point, when could that advice come to the Scottish Government? Because they are clearly asking you for the advice.
On
Emma,
so on, yeah, well, I do. I mean, I think on Acorn, the size of Acorn means that we have had to say it's like, having said we don't do plant by plant where we can avoid it. This is one of those which I flagged where there is a place-based or a single infrastructure project decision which we recognise as a contingency. If it's what Emily didn't do, I think, is talk about how we view nets and why that's different to what the Scottish Government is doing. So broadly speaking, in our pathway, nets are there to accommodate for areas of the economy where there will still be emissions, because, and very broadly, by the time that you have delivered emissions reduction in all areas of the economy, what you have left is agriculture and aviation, with a few industrial emissions. Looks different, slightly different in the UK and Scotland on the exact proportion, but that's the deal. There's no mechanical sheep and cows and people. There is no kind of complete equivalent for a plane for people to be able to travel internationally. So we assume that those sectors will continue to emit. The way that we've done our advice on negative emissions technologies is both bottom up. What technologies are available? Are they scalable? Do we think they're credible? What can we see in the international market? And a project like Acorn is that kind of project. But then we've also looked at those negative emissions technologies and removals, and trees, which are a natural kind of removal, and peatland, in the context of the sectors of the economy that are still emitting. So where you have agricultural emissions, trees and peatland to set those off, and where you have aviation, we have assumed a polluter pays model where the aviation sector is bringing forward removals technologies and negative emissions technologies. So the answer to your question is, well, you have to look at those sectors, but by the time you get to 2045, you're looking at other things in those sectors. And if you look at the 7th Carbon Budget Advice and the chapter on contingencies, we talk about things that happen if you don't get the kind of change in, for example, diet that we would anticipate through just making healthier alternatives more available, and the things that we've recommended on flying, what the alternatives are if these technologies don't come forward. And they are a mix of things. Demand management is one of them, but I would encourage you to look at that. For Scottish Government, I think the risk that Emily is highlighting is they are using negative emissions technologies to do things which aren't, instead of abatement that we can see is possible in other areas of the economy. So the contingency is do those things, but do the roll out the heat pumps that need to be rolled out. Think about the changes in agriculture potentially. And I think that's important. Interestingly, just to be specific about this, in the CCP, I think the Scottish Government has said they're going to make up a shortfall in, for example, agricultural emissions or the differences in our pathway through a faster deployment of electric vehicles. Actually, we think when you look at the numbers, that shortfall is being made up of negative emissions technologies, which is why we are saying, well, the contingency for that is to go harder in the sectors that you have said as a choice. Which is completely the right of the Scottish Government. They're choosing to do different things in. So hopefully that's a clarifier. Again, we'd be very happy to, where there's evidence that sits in the 7th Carbon Budget in the UK-wide advice that would be useful in this context, we can share that with the committee after the session as well, if you've not seen it.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, we're going to come to Bob, who's got some questions on agriculture. We have talked quite extensively about agriculture, and I could talk all day about it, but concise questions and concise answers would help me to get to Kevin within the time frame. Bob, with respect.
Convener, I'm sure tight share of the committee will make that happen. So can I perhaps just ask a few brief questions on agriculture, in particular around the Scottish Government not taking the pathway advice in relation to the reduction in livestock. Some of the narrative around that from the Scottish Government has been that reducing the livestock to grow crops may not be best for Scotland's geography, for example. I'm sure there's other reasons as well. The Scottish Government didn't take that option. But just briefly, Emma, perhaps some reflections on the Scottish Government rationale in relation to that?
Well, I think, the rationale they've given is, excuse me, by the way, I've got 2 small children, they made me ill over half term, and I'm still ill and they're fine. So what they've said is that it is both, the political choice and delivery on the ground. And I think that is the difference between what we do as an independent body and the choices that you face as policymakers all the time. So to that extent, when Scott Govern initially signalled that they were going to do something different to our pathway, we all said that's absolutely fine. We are, ultimately, our main aim is to give you advice on that target level. The pathway that we provide is illustrative to show you that the targets are feasible, and it is fine for the pathways to differ. Away from that, in terms of what we would need to think that the CCP analysis was a credible alternative pathway, is all the things that we've talked about in terms of how fast they're going to go in other sectors. Just to illustrate our approach.
Emma, can I just come in there? Because I think we've already discussed negative emission technologies, and we've discussed peatland restoration as part of that pathway. I suppose what I was trying to explore was the rationale the Scottish Government gave doesn't jar with you. It's their political choice, and you're fine with that. It's about whether the alternative pathways are valid. The one aspect we've not spoken about is in relation to reforesting and tree planting. We've not really discussed that at committee. My understanding is that, so apologies for cutting across you, but I just wanted to be sure there's time to ask this question, is that the Scottish Government is front-loading much of its tree planting, and in the first climate change plan is ahead of what the Climate Change Committee was recommending. So I'm just wondering, in that first plan, I'm guessing that would be welcome. So it's just if you're able to confirm that. However, obviously the modelling work, again, the Scottish Government is showing under it's called the Carbine model, means that the benefits from reforesting are more stated with the Scottish Government based on their modelling work, which they think is a more informed modelling work, and the Climate Change Committee, this is totally respectful, I have no idea which one to opt for, Emma, had more limited knowledge and therefore was less accurate. So some comments around that I think would be quite helpful.
So I'm not familiar with that particular bit of evidence, so the team might be able to get Emily to come in. Very broadly, we look at all of the peer-reviewed and published evidence that we possibly can in time to do the analysis, and if new evidence comes forwards, we're always, and it's credible, and the committee feels that it's useful, then we will obviously update our pathways accordingly. Right, that would be best practice. In terms of where we have concerns about the CPP advice on peatland and woodland, or where there's alignment, there's very good news for Scotland in the restoration of peatland, I think, doubling the rates over the last 2 years. I think we've got 14,900 hectares out to 2025. So there's good signs that policy has been working. Similarly, tree planting doubled between the years 2023 and 2024. It is absolutely true that you need to front load tree planting, and it's for a really obvious reason, which is it takes 25 years for trees to grow. So you need to have them early so that you get the emissions benefit in time for when the net zero goal is. All of that's to say, we also think that we need about 18,000 hectares of woodland this decade, so it's a significant amount of tree planting. And as I've said, we think about tree planting in Scotland both in the UK-wide context and in the Scottish one. So all of that message about go early and needing to maintain support is important still. Where there are differences, which it would really help to have some of the underpinning assumptions in the CPP for, we have modelled our change in agriculture, so livestock numbers and land use changes in general, alongside what we're saying is possible for tree planting and peatland restoration. And I think it's not clear to us whether government have made that same calculation, so whether there is in effect a double counting on the use of land that they think is possible in a managed context. Like how do you have farming and livestock or crop production and the peatland and tree planting? That's something that we've thought about in our analysis, and we've also done it completely closed loop with changes in consumption habits and diet and the needs of production on that land. So it's not, we don't think the Scottish Government have taken that approach, so it would be useful to understand how they're sure about the land use piece. And then secondly, we are concerned about the funding for tree planting and nature restoration and the plan across the piece for that, you know, waiting for the fourth land use strategy, but also the agricultural reform programme tier 2 payments to come forward. And we noted this at the beginning, but tree planting rates having been high and successful have dropped off since the change in the forestry grant scheme, and that is a real concern as well, given the level of ambition.
I think those are points well made, and I'll make this final question clear. I won't come back in because of time constraints. That was all really important to put on the record, Emma, and it's helpful to the committee. But the Scottish Government's overall tree planting over the lifetime of the plans outlaid, I don't think go beyond what the Climate Change Committee were suggesting. The difference is that the modelling they're using to assert the benefit of that tree planting, they say, is more accurate, more informed, and I say that respectfully, than the information available to the Climate Change Committee, and therefore the quantum of trees being planted are not any greater, despite that being their alternative pathway. At any point with the Climate Change Committee take a view on the Scottish Government's modelling work, I suppose, is the substantive question.
We will do. I can see Emily's got her finger up, so I'd like her to answer whether we have directly seen this particular modelling from the officials. But this is similar to the problem or the issue that we've raised on peatland, for example, where the Scottish Government have very positively invested in more detailed evidence collection about emissions from Scottish peatland, and that has caused some of the difference between their pathway on peatland and ours, though it's not just about having the evidence, it's how it's applied in the modelling. So in that case, we think they've possibly applied the changes in a way that means that they get a benefit bigger than even they should have, even if with the updated evidence. That evidence was not out in time or kind of sufficient for us to use it for our own peatland numbers, but we would always integrate good evidence when we have it. Emily, on forestry.
Yeah, so just quickly on the modelling, I think in chapter 3...
Emily, sorry, I'm just going to say as briefly, please, just conscious of timings. The clock doesn't stop for you either, I'm afraid. It doesn't stop for any of us.
The main difference in modelling is really this peatland thing, and we have that in chapter 3 of the report where we do undo that correction, and actually our pathways are much more similar. So you can see that in the report. In the forestry modelling, we are under discussion. We're both using a carbine aligned approach. There may well be some differences in exactly how they're used, and this is very much an uncertain area. So we're sort of continuing dialogue there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Bob, and thanks for getting your questions in as quickly as possible. We move to Kevin for your questions.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. One of the things which you have said this morning, one of the things which is quite clear in terms of the vision that is put out there, is that a lot of the ambition is based on cheaper electricity. And you said that yourself earlier, Emma. And you said that a lot of the decisions around about that is for us as policymakers. Well, neither the Scottish Government or the Scottish Parliament have any say over electricity prices. So that is obviously a massive risk if prices do not drop. And we have a situation where electricity prices at the moment are pegged to international gas prices. We have seen in some reports a 93% rise over a period in the past 48 hours in gas prices. The European benchmark has risen by 33%, the UK benchmark by 30% over the past day. Is it about time that the UK government helped us all in terms of gaining that cheaper electricity in order for us to reach our ambitions by removing the linkage of electricity prices being pegged to international gas prices? Emma, please.
Oh, you're going to dislike this answer, but if you'd asked me in my last...
He disliked it so much he cut the microphone off, and you hadn't even got there. Sorry, just wait a moment, just while we get it reconnected.
I did not cut you off.
I bet a lot of people wish they could do that more often.
No, we can hear you now.
Look, in my last job, I'd have been able to talk to you about energy market design, but it's not in the scope for what the Climate Change Committee do. Again, because there are significant economic and other trade-offs that sit well outside climate if you're making changes through energy markets. What we would say, and there is analysis on this in the 7th carbon budget for UK-wide, is that exposure to fossil fuel volatility is real, and that if we have another price shock of the sort of significance of the one in 2022, households with electric technologies are 15 times less exposed to that price shock than if we continue with an assumption that the people's technologies in the homes look like they are today. So there is a significant economic risk from that volatility that we have modelled.
Can I stop you there? Because you mentioned 2022, and looking at what has happened over the past 72, 96 hours or so, we're seeing that volatility again with a rise in international gas prices, which our domestic electricity prices are pegged to. You're saying that there will be less volatility for those folks that rely on electricity only. I am one of those folks, and I have to be honest and say that my electricity bill has gone through the roof over that period of time. So the only way that we're going to persuade others to move away from fossil fuels to electricity, surely, is to reduce the cost of electricity and not peg it to international gas prices, as is currently the case. Surely that's logical.
Sorry, to explain those numbers, and I'm conscious of short answers, so perhaps I won't do the whole thing now, but these are in a net zero world with a household with a heat pump and electric vehicle. Because of the efficiencies of those technologies, they're not, say, the electric heating that you have today, and with action to remove the levies off electricity bills, so with no further energy market action, but with a kind of rebalancing of how we're doing policy costs, because of the way policy costs flow through the system, because of the increased percentage of renewables on the system, we're confident that a household with those technologies will be less exposed to future fossil fuel price shock than not, and the economy will too. In terms of your question, we have recommended as a committee that action is taken on levy reform. The UK government did a bit of that in the budget, but the critical thing is to get the gap between electricity and gas prices closed, and we don't think it was done sufficiently to do that. There are other things you could do, including the market reforms that you are talking about, and I'm sure the energy sector and others are talking to you about those. And just lastly, though, there are things within the devolved powers that you can do to help people get the benefits of clean technologies and lower bills, and that might include things like looking at solar deployment and storage, alongside thinking about heat pump rollout, because these technologies help you get the benefit of cheap electricity generation at either community level or household level, and that is something else that we're looking at in terms of being able to think about how we get cheap electricity.
So you pointed out earlier yourself that Scotland is somewhat different in the fact that there are so many tenemented properties, right? I live in one. I'm never going to have a heat pump. I'm never going to have solar panels because nobody will agree to have them at this moment in time. And I don't drive, so I don't have the EV car benefit. I've never driven. I pay, as I pointed out, as do many others, huge electricity bills. huge electricity bills. Now, in order for other folks to move to electricity, we need that cheap electricity. Now, I recognise that you are not a policymaker, that you are an advisor, and you said that the Energy Secretary will be listening to us. I wish the Energy Secretary would listen to us. Surely the Climate Change Committee must have some opinions, some advice that they will give to the UK Government, who are responsible for this at this moment, to ensure that those folks who can't have heat pumps, who can't have solar, who can't have battery storage, actually get cheaper electricity, so that they can make the choices of maybe moving from gas to electricity. Because at this moment in time, for somebody in my situation, with the bills that I've got, I would not be saying to anyone that I know who's in a tenement with gas, move to electricity at this moment.
I completely hear that, and as I said, I think fairness is something that's come out of our social research, but also something that we have looked at quantitatively in the 7th Carbon Budget advice. So I can tell you that we have made this recommendation to government. It's in the analysis for the 7th Carbon Budget. Now, we did two things in our advice to all UK governments and then specifically to Westminster in the carbon budgets. We said across the UK we need cheap electricity prices. That is an economic policy and a social policy as well as a carbon policy. There are, though, and this is the difference, there are multiple ways you can deliver that reduction, and some of them sit well outside the mandate for what we think of as climate policy. I spent 15 years in the energy sector. If you'd asked me to give evidence in that last job, I'd have talked to you about market reforms to help economic growth that are about wholesale, low electricity costs and about energy costs in general. We might have spoken about some of the markets under electricity market reform. We might have talked about retail policies and how we get lower tariffs to people in all electric households. We might have looked at the roles of the regulators. This is all firmly outside the committee's mandate because it speaks to wider economic and social policy. There are other things that governments can do, such as grants and targeted support for households that are particularly vulnerable. And again, that sits in social policy outside of climate policy. However, what we did do in the 7th Carbon Budget analysis is model different household types. So we have been upfront at showing how the impacts of low carbon policies and those electricity costs fall on different households. There are 12 different household archetypes with different technology mixes and different kinds of property in the analysis.
Emma,
and one of them is a building like your tenement building. And it shows absolutely the case that you're making, that you are one of the rare households that will not benefit from this transition without targeted support.
So I'm not one of these rare people at all. Because
in Scotland, you're 25% of the population, though, which is something that we also said.
And for my own constituency, it is the majority of the folk, quite frankly.
Yeah.
In energy-rich Aberdeen, we are the ones that are being screwed, basically. Which has always been the case, unfortunately. And it may well be, you know, that the Climate Change Committee does not have the remit to look at every aspect of market reform and all of the rest of it. But you are an advisory group to governments, and surely because you've talked about all of the risks and all of this, and that change in terms of household change is one of the biggest risks, surely those conversations have to include a drive towards cheaper electricity.
I'm completely agreeing with you. I think what I'm saying is I would contend the idea that we haven't said that to the UK government repeatedly in all of the advice we've given, in every select committee performance, in every media engagement and every public engagement we do. It is our #1 recommendation from the committee. It remains the #1 recommendation. We have even gone as far as illustrating different ways you could do it, though being careful to stay inside our mandate on that. And we would completely agree with you that that is essential. And we have also flagged that it's particularly essential in Scotland with the number of people who live in tenement properties, where it is a different commercial arrangement, a different technology mix, and people are on electric heating already. So I suppose we violently agree, and I think we have done our job in that way in saying it to Westminster, and will continue to do it. We think it is a it has been disappointing that we haven't had more action on that, though there has been some action in the budget and in the Warm Homes Plan.
I'm glad that we violently disagree at the end. We got there eventually. I want to turn to another point which you covered earlier, and that is around about utilising the North Sea basin rather than importing. And you talked about the counterfactuality around about the use of domestic supply compared to importing amounts of oil and gas. And you said that this is a complicated area, and I don't disagree with you on that front. And you offered to brief the committee further, which I think we would welcome. But the difficulty is that briefing the committee is not getting the message out to the public around about your reasoning for that counterfactuality. And beyond that, I wonder if you would comment, and again, you may say that this is not in your remit, but surely it would be wiser to utilise resource here, which is often less carbon intense, rather than importing LNG from Qatar, if that's going to be possible in the future, and who knows with the volatility that's going on. And beyond that, what are you looking at and others looking at in terms of jobs? Because utilising our own resource rather than importing is obviously going to protect jobs here rather than in Qatar, the United States or elsewhere.
Thank you. Look, and again, answers to questions which I realise are not entirely satisfactory, but for the purpose of setting the carbon budgets, that question of the North Sea, the kind of the decision, the impacts on things like jobs, the counterfactual of importing or exporting fuels or using our domestic production is much richer than the accounting framework for the carbon budgets. And some of that is about economic policy and industrial decision making as much as it is any decision making on net zero. We have looked at the oil and gas industry in Scotland up to the extent that it matters for your domestic carbon targets. Beyond that, there is this question about things like offshoring emissions and making sure that we're not pushing industries overseas. And we've looked at that in how we set our advice and advise on the North Sea. We do also look at jobs, and we have spoken to some of the workers in Aberdeen about what they would like, their skills and so on, and what's needed for a just transition. I would direct you on the jobs question to the Just Transition Commission, who do a lot of good work on this in Scotland. It's very much in their mandate, and to the work of the NSTA. And I think you've spoken to Offshore Energies UK as well. These are the bodies that are tasked with looking at the North Sea in that complexity. We have looked at it in as much as we need to do to give you advice on your domestic emissions.
So I get all of that, and I think it would be fair to say that all of us round this table have spoken to either all or most of those bodies. And I get your point around about your remit. However, in terms of the public at large, you are the advisors in terms of climate change. You are the ones that are pushing governments to meet net zero ambitions. And yet there's all of these other folk that you're saying we should go and speak to. And the public, I think quite rightly, think that there is a level of fragmentation here and that the jigsaw has not been completed. Now, in an age where there are a lot of climate sceptical politicians on the go at this moment, and it seems to be increasing, surely we owe it to the public to complete that jigsaw so that they can see exactly what's required. Would you agree?
I mean, two thoughts quickly on this. One, the reason it is not just our job is obviously the decline in the North Sea Basin is not just, in fact, it's not really because of domestic net zero targets. That is a much more complex conversation. You need those other bodies and that wider perspective in to do justice to that conversation. And that's directly from the experience of talking to those communities in Aberdeen. In terms of the communication, yes, I think we need to give you the information you need to have good conversations with people, but we are not a body that is set up with the resources or the expertise to speak directly to the public. What we aim to do is give you information alongside other statutory bodies that you as parliamentarians can have those conversations with people, and we completely agree with the recommendation that we need to do better communication with the public. That is why it's the other continuous recommendation to all 4 nations of the UK alongside cheap electricity prices as an enabler for everything. Always happy, and we've said this to other parliamentary groups, if there is information or evidence or feedback on how we present our advice, the language we use, the kind of format of it, things that would make that communications job easier, absolutely we'd be happy to hear about that and what we can do to contribute to that conversation. But we cannot be the body that does the direct communication with the public.
So my point about the jigsaw was not entirely just about oil and gas in the North Sea Basin. It is the overall picture, going right the way through my lines of questioning and other folks' lines of questioning here. And I recognise that you are only an advisory body and cannot do the entire thing. But in terms of that communication, you know, I've seen you yourself on various programmes in recent times. I think, you know, the communication is fine to a degree, and I'm not being critical of you. I just think the public needs the complete picture. And quite frankly, their expectation is that the Climate Change Committee is the organisation, the neutral organisation, some would say, to give that messaging across. My final point is, and you said earlier as well that your chair, Nigel Topping, was in Aberdeen recently, and the only reason I know that is because he visited Aberdeen Community Energy's hydro plant on the River Don, and I follow them quite regularly. A pity that some of us didn't know that he was there, because I think, you know, many of us, including the elected politicians, would have benefited from maybe accompanying him in some of the visits and maybe giving indicators of where to visit. But I'll leave it at that, and maybe that's something that you could take away.
Well, just for the record, we did write to the leaders of every political party in Scotland that has parliamentarians represented in the Scottish Parliament and invited them to meet with Nigel when he was up on that trip. We heard back from some, but not others. Others couldn't make the diary work. Nigel wants to meet the leaders of the parties because he's a new chair and he thinks that's appropriate. So would it, and I agree. And of course, next time he's very keen to come back to Aberdeen again.
Emma,
he really enjoyed his time there, so I'm sure he'd meet you then.
Emma, if I could just say that I always think that it's courteous, whoever's visiting, to reach out to locally elected politicians so they could be involved.
Yeah.
So maybe that's because the likes of Kevin and I are never going to be the leaders of our party. So, but it's always nice to meet people when they come into our patch.
I will make sure next time that that's passed on to the team. And could I say one more thing on this point about communication and outreach? And it comes back to the beginning. We will do and be able to do more. I think we do a lot with the resources we have. And on communications and stakeholder work in particular, it is a very, very small team at the CCC. And in fact, we have no dedicated resource for that in Devolved. So it is just what you see, which is us doing the media when we have a statutory report. If there was a desire for this body to do more and to give that independent and expert view in more ways to the public, to do work with local politicians, to do those kind of stakeholder trips, we would fundamentally need more resources. And that's part of what the constraint is in doing more. I'll be happy to talk about it, though.
Okay, thank you for that. And Mark, a very brief question from you, because I'd like to have the last one, if I may.
Yeah, thanks. And can I actually thank Nigel and his team for the meeting that we had last week. Can I ask you, though, just going back to buildings, particularly around the point of sale regulations, which the Scottish Government introduced and have now dropped. Can I ask whether that's something that the CCC still supports, or given the price of electricity at the moment, do you see an approach where there's effectively a kind of trigger point for the introduction of those regulations that's related to the electricity price could be another way forward?
Emily, you've traditionally had strong views on point of sale. Would you like to do this one?
So I think it's something that we were really positive about when we saw it in the original draft bill. What I would say is that, you know, we're not saying exactly what the policies need to be, but there's a sort of combination here of support at the beginning, getting the markets going, the grants, etc., and then a sort of longer term plan for is there going to be regulation in there? Also public engagement, leading by example, etc. I think, and Emma's alluded to this already, we need to look at what has happened in electricity pricing. So we've had the Warm Homes Plan. There has been some steps taken there. We haven't assessed the Warm Homes Plan yet. We'll be doing that in our UK progress report, but there are measures in there for bringing bills down for people with heat pumps, and just in general bringing bills down with solar and batteries, etc. So I really think it's worth looking at again through that lens, like what homes can save, etc., and then build up a plan that sort of combines these sort of incentives in the shorter term, and then what's going to happen in the longer term, and look at that. We haven't got we're not policy prescriptive saying exactly what needs to happen, but we do think there needs to be a clearer plan in both the short and longer term.
Thank you. Right, having had the first questions, I'm afraid you're going to get one from me at the end, and Emma, it's coming to you in the sense that looking back at your history of CEO of Energy UK and some of the comments that you've made this morning about costings, I've spent hours poring through Annex 3 of the Climate Change Plan, and rather like you, struggled to understand what all the facts and well, I understand some of the facts, but I certainly didn't understand the figures. And as you know, the committee has made it clear that it would have been helpful to see more of the workings so we understood them. And I think the evidence you gave to Kevin Stewart this morning was that there were 12 different, I think it was building types that you were suggesting in Scotland. So what I'm trying to drive down is to get people to sign up to a plan, Emma, as you well know as a CEO, is they've got to understand what it's going to cost them. And they've got to understand how that's going to be delivered and what they're expected to pay. So I haven't been able to work that out. Do you think it's unreasonable for me to expect people on all levels across Scotland to understand, to be able to understand what the costs of achieving this plan are? Because I think if they don't know, they won't sign up to it. Am I being unreasonable, Emma?
I think we would agree with you that having costings that are where the method is clear and transparent, and your inputs, so your kind of your assumptions that you're making about technologies and costs are clear, is a good thing. We publish all of our costings work and our methodologies, as you know, when we do our advice, and we try and show the costs of investment, the savings you can expect to get, the overall picture net, which we should say is a positive one for the Scottish economy overall. But we also do try and make suggestions about likely business models and how things fall. And you've mentioned one where we do that. We look at how the costs fall across different households. Just to be clear, it's 12 household archetypes across the UK, one of which is similar to a tenement building in Scotland, but all different kinds of household archetypes. We do the same for farming as well, different farming archetypes. But we would also think about, as well as that distributed cost, we're also thinking about in some areas of the economy where it might be a private sector-led polluter pays mechanism or something that's public sector driven. And I think that sort of approach means that even when it's not our job to determine where exactly those trade-offs are, where exactly you want to put in targeted support, how exactly you want the mechanisms to work, it at least gives you a sense of what you should do. I'm sure as parliamentarians, you're looking for similar evidence when you make those decisions.
I think as parliamentarians, we're looking to get people in to buy into plans that we're putting forward. And the only way, in my mind, that they do that if they understand what the costs are. But maybe on that note, that's a good point to leave it. Thank you very much for the evidence that you've given this morning. It's been quite a long session, and even I, yet again, failed to keep to the timings that I'd set myself. So I apologise for that, but that's not all my fault. Maybe long and detailed answers have helped getting there. But thank you very much. And we're going to move straight on to the next item of business on our agenda. So thank you. And we'll move on to item 7, which is the consideration of a negative SI. This is the Scottish Roadworks Register Prescribed Fees Regulations 2026. This is laid under the negative procedure, which means it will come into force unless the Parliament agrees a motion to annul it. And I can say at this stage, no motion has been lodged. The instrument prescribes the fees payable as a condition of access to the Scottish Road Works Register for the period 1st of April 26 to the 31st of March 27. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has made no comment on the instrument. I'm looking to members to see if they have any comments on it. I think this is the 9th one of these that I've looked at, and I always struggle to understand all of it. But there we go. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Convener. I just had a question on the actual implementation of it and the purpose of it, whether it actually links to incentives to deliver joined-up roadworks and better quality outcomes, because minor roadworks can lead to poor standards and potholes not long after they've been done. So I was just wondering if we could ask a question about the joined-up approach to this and what outcome is expected to have, given the range of different organisations that quite often go on to change our road surfaces, and then it leads to problems X years down the line. Thank you.
I think that's an interesting point, and I think it's one that we could write to the government on when we notify our position on this, because I think it's useful, because I think we've all noticed the issues that you've mentioned. Does anyone have any other comments? No, so there's no recommendations. I'm just going to ask... we agreed to note that to the government, but also write on the specific point that Sarah's mentioned regarding repairs and making sure that those are long-lasting. Agreed. Thank you very much, and we're now going to move into private.